Hey guys, tonight we're slipping behind the silk curtains of a world most history books don't touch. We're heading deep into Imperial China, not to study emperors or wars, but to sit quietly in the candlelight with women history tried to erase. Courtesans, songstresses, entertainers, and yes, prostitutes. You probably won't survive this era if you were born female and poor, but you might just thrive, briefly, if you could sing, seduce, and survive betrayal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, what city are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in Chang'an, capital of the Tang dynasty, somewhere between the 7th and 8th centuries. It's night, and the city thrums like a living thing. Red lanterns sway above cobbled alleys. Perfumed air curls from tea houses and pleasure pavilions tucked discreetly between aristocratic mansions and merchant stalls. You've wandered beyond the main road into an area known only by whispers, the flower streets. The smell of incense is thick, warm, mingled with powdered makeup and the metallic tang of wine that's been refilled too many times. You duck beneath a carved wooden archway, its dragons worn smooth from time and touch. Ahead is a long, narrow hall, glowing gold from within. You step lightly across the threshold of a high-end brothel, not the chaotic dives you'd find by the docks, but a polished, expensive house known for its literary girls. They aren't just bodies for hire, they're artists trained in poetry, music, calligraphy and conversation. Their job is to entertain scholars, nobles, and occasionally passing emperors. You're here as a curious traveller, or maybe an unlucky young man with a handful of borrowed coin. The madam greets you with a practiced smile. She looks somewhere between 40 and 400 years old, wearing a robe so stiff with embroidery it crackles as she moves. You're offered tea you can't afford and asked which flower you'd like to meet. The names sound like poetry, plum rain, dancing cicada, white fragrance. You choose one randomly, heart pounding slightly as she's summoned from behind a silken partition. She arrives without sound, her embroidered slippers barely touching the lacquered floor. Her face is powdered white, lips a perfect crimson bow, eyebrows arched like calligraphy strokes. Her voice is softer than the guqin she plays. You sit, you listen. You nod as she speaks of a famous Tang poem you only half remember. It feels like theatre. It is theatre. But there's something else here too. An undercurrent of danger. Let's get one thing clear. The life of a courtesan in Imperial China is not glamorous. Not really. Behind the silks and odes is a brutal truth. Many girls didn't choose this life. They were sold by starving families, kidnapped during famines, or born into brothel lineages where escape was almost impossible. The brothels were often debt prisons. The madam, for all her warmth, owns her girls the same way a merchant owns silks or spices. You don't walk away just because you've fallen in love, or sung a poem that made a nobleman cry. You leave only when the house says you're done, or dead. But the girl before you, she's perfected the art of pretending it's a choice. She pours your wine with a flourish. She laughs, not too loudly. She corrects your misquoted poem with grace, even admiration. You see her make eye contact with someone behind you, a eunuch maybe, someone watching. Every movement she makes has been choreographed for your pleasure and her survival. Here's something wild. In some elite brothels during the Tang and Song-dynasties, courtesans were more educated than the men they served. That wasn't just coincidence, it was marketing. Wealthy scholars loved the idea of being intellectually seduced. These women trained for years in poetry and music before being allowed to entertain guests. Some even published poetry collections, though often under male pseudonyms. Their words were praised, even as their names were kept out of history's honourable mentions. One famous courtesan, Xue Tao, was a renowned poet and calligrapher during the Tang dynasty. She was so respected that some scholars visited her not for sex, but for advice on their verse. But even Xue Tao, with all her acclaim, was still a woman in a gilded cage. She had to rely on powerful patrons for survival, and her fame didn't protect her from aging out of usefulness. Now here's a quirky little detail. Some brothels had menus, like literal poetry and talent menus. You could choose whether you wanted a musical performance, a painting demonstration, or a philosophical debate about Taoism. Physical intimacy wasn't always on offer, especially in higher-end houses. You could spend a small fortune and never even touch her hand. Some nobles preferred it that way. They wanted the illusion, the drama, the unattainable. But behind the scenes, there were scars, a lot of them. Women who tried to escape or refused a powerful client could be beaten, hidden, or sold again to lower-tier houses. Addiction to opium and powdered sleep aids was common, especially among girls forced to entertain late into the night. And while the state occasionally issued decrees to clean up the pleasure districts, they mostly did it for optics. Prostitution was too profitable. Local officials were often on the take. No one wanted to kill the goose that laid golden poems. There was still an ongoing scholarly debate about the agency of these women. Were they victims? Entrepreneurs? Artists using the only tools available in a patriarchal society? Some historians argue that elite courtesans held real power, emotional, cultural, even political. Others say that's wishful thinking, a way to romanticize a deeply exploitative system. The truth probably lives in between. Pockets of freedom wrapped in layers of control. Back in the brothel, your courtesan lowers her eyes as she finishes a song. You clap softly, unsure of what to do next. She leans in slightly and whispers a line from a banned poem, something about lotus blossoms blooming in muddy waters. It's a test. Maybe she's just teasing. Maybe she's a rebel. Or maybe she wants you to think she is, which honestly might be more dangerous. The room's air has shifted. Behind the elegance, you feel the weight of centuries, of hidden pain, quiet resistance, and beauty crafted under duress. The performance is over, but the story has just begun. You wake up the next morning. If you slept at all, with the smell of incense still clinging to your clothes, the memory of her voice lingers, but it's not just her performance you remember. It's the way her hand trembled slightly as she poured the wine, the flicker of fear when she saw the eunuch at the door. There was something else behind her smile, something rehearsed, something learned. Now you're wondering, how did she get here? The road to becoming a courtesan in Imperial China wasn't a path chosen so much as one thrust upon girls long before they understood what it meant. You picture a rural village, rice paddies in the distance, a family crumbling under debt or drought. Maybe it's winter, maybe it's famine, maybe her father's gone, and her mother has too many mouths to feed. A man arrives, an agent, smiling too much. He promises the girl will be trained in the arts, that she'll be clothed and fed and taught to read. Which, technically, is all true. He just doesn't mention the locks on the doors or the fact that poetry lessons are paid for in flesh. Training begins early. Some girls enter the system as young as 6 or 7. They're not sold into full service immediately, they're flower buds, expected to bloom in time. The house invests in them. Calligraphy tutors, music masters, dance instructors. Girls are given new names, symbolic ones, names like Crimson Orchid, Jade Smoke, or Autumn Whisper. Their real names are buried along with their childhoods. If they're lucky, they retain fragments. If not, the transformation is complete. The training isn't gentle. Mistakes are corrected with slaps, long hours, humiliation. Some houses use isolation rooms, dark, windowless chambers where rebellious girls are confined until they submit. Discipline is constant because perfection isn't optional. A crooked stroke of the brush, a note off key, a giggle at the wrong time, any of these can ruin a girl's first impression and reduce her value. And the value of a courtesan is everything. Her worth is calculated in coin, favours and status. She's not a person, she's a performance. And business must be good. Still, it's not all darkness. Some girls excel, some genuinely fall in love with poetry, with music, with the power of captivating a room. These girls become favourites, praised for their elegance, their wit. They learn how to manipulate powerful men with a glance or a verse. And in a world where being born female meant obedience and invisibility, the courtesan stage becomes a strange kind of liberation. But this freedom is conditional, always. Their bodies belong to the house, their time belongs to the clients. Their futures belong to fate or the madam, whichever comes first. The madam herself is a character worth unpacking. She wasn't born powerful. Most likely, she was once a courtesan too, maybe even a famous one. If she played her cards right, she managed to save enough or earn the favour of a patron willing to invest in her. She's a gatekeeper now, wielding control with sharp smiles and sharper threats. She protects her girls, sometimes, but she also sells them, disciplines them, and negotiates their services like a merchant haggling over silk bolts. She's complex, a villain to some, a saviour to others, and a survivor above all. There's a phrase used in some of the oldest brothel records, cultivating the flower. It sounds poetic, almost innocent, but it refers to preparing a girl for her first night. the moment when she's officially introduced to the clientele. These events are often disguised as banquets, extravagant affairs with musicians, wine, and poetry recitals. Wealthy clients bid for the right to spend the night with the newest courtesan. The highest bidder wins, the girl doesn't. The practice isn't hidden. It's ritualized. The house makes a fortune. The girl becomes known. Her value skyrockets if the client is powerful, a minister, a prince, or even an emperor. But beneath the gold and glitter, it's still what it is. Sanctioned, ritualized violation. And once it happens, there's no going back. She's no longer a child, she's an asset. It's a difficult truth to sit with. History has a way of dressing these things in ornate robes, of making them seem elegant or noble. But behind every polished verse and painted fan is a very real person, a teenager most likely, trying to survive in a system that only values her when she smiles. One curious detail. Some brothels employed old women called mammasans, who kept detailed logs of each courtesan's training schedule and client history. These were like ledgers, but for people. Each girl had a rate, which fluctuated depending on her skill, popularity, and reputation. If she refused a client, the house could fine her. If she fell ill, she was replaced, sometimes permanently. Her worth was economic, measurable, and entirely conditional. But here's where it gets even stranger. Not all of this was done in secret. In many cities, pleasure quarters were legal and even regulated by local officials. They brought in tax revenue, brothels were inspected, some had to post signage declaring their specialties, as if they were restaurants. The whole setup was designed to blend vice with bureaucracy, because as long as the money flowed, no one asked too many questions. And yet, scholars still debate whether these girls had any agency. Some argue they were clever manipulators of the system, using beauty and intellect to carve out power in a patriarchal empire. Others insist they were victims of cultural double standards, locked in a cycle of exploitation. The truth, again, is probably both. A courtesan might spend her night charming a prince and her morning scrubbing blood out of silk. Glamour and abuse weren't opposites. They were intertwined. Back in your memory, the girl from last night lingers. You recall her posture, so graceful it seemed effortless. And then remember it was probably beaten into her. You think about how easily she laughed at your clumsy jokes, how perfectly she poured the wine. She's been trained to make you feel special, important. That's the product, really. Not sex, not music, but the illusion of intimacy. The fantasy that for a night you're the only one who matters. But in her world, you're one of hundreds, maybe thousands, and tomorrow she'll do it all again, with someone else, under the same lantern light. You're back in the flower streets tonight, though maybe streets is too generous a word. They're more like veins curling around tea shops, shadowed courtyards, and houses whose windows never open. Everything here moves behind screens and silks. You're starting to notice things. How every building has the same flickering lanterns, the same heavy wooden doors. The women change, the music drifts, the scents vary, but the rules? Those don't bend. And once you learn the rules, you see everything differently. Let's talk about hierarchy. Because yes, even among women who are owned and sold, there's a pecking order as intricate as the layers of their robes. This world is not lawless. It is rigidly, obsessively structured. And knowing where you sit in the house can mean the difference between sleeping on silk and dying in debt. At the top, the Yiji, the elite courtesans. Think of them as celebrities with an expiration date. They're not just entertainers, they're cultural icons. They recite classical poetry, debate Confucian philosophy, play instruments most people can't even name. They don't sleep with every client, many don't at all. Their job is seduction of the mind, the illusion of romance. And for that they command obscene fees. Wealthy patrons throw parties just to show off their favourite Yiji, like one might show off a rare painting or a trained falcon. It's not love, it's prestige. Then come the Shuyu, courtesans of moderate rank. These women are trained and talented, but not as rarefied as the Yiji. They perform in smaller venues, entertain merchants and minor officials, and yes, offer more physical services. They don't write poetry for emperors, but they might recite it for a grain trader who's had a good season. They're the workforce of the pleasure quarters, still elegant, still desirable, but a tier down in both treatment and freedom. And beneath them, the street-level sex workers. These women live hard, fast, and often short lives. No art, no training, just negotiation, survival, and a rotating cast of clients. Many operate in alleys or behind taverns, some are barely past girlhood. Others are old enough to remember 3 emperors. They don't have madams, they don't have contracts, they don't have protection. They are the unacknowledged labour force of the night, used and discarded. Inside the houses, the women also rank themselves. There's the top girl, the courtesan who brings in the most money, the one who gets first pick of clients, best rooms, better food. She's often the madam's favourite. Her robes are newer. Her makeup is done by handmaidens instead of herself. She might even have a private garden, but she's also the most watched. One bad decision, one jealous noble, one secret pregnancy, and she can fall overnight. Further down the ranks, the girls are interchangeable. They share rooms, they mend their own clothes, they're assigned clients, sometimes with a coin toss. These are the ones learning the ropes, working off their debt, or just trying to stay invisible. They whisper to each other when no one's listening. They trade warnings, fake illness, dream about freedom in the smallest, saddest ways, like getting to sleep through the night or wearing white in string. Even the servants inside the brothel have a caste system. The musicians, the cooks, the doormen, the older women who powder the girls and clean the floors, they all know their place. And if they forget, someone reminds them, usually the madam. She walks like a general, her voice soft but always edged with command. She knows every transaction, every secret, every nickname the girls give to their least favourite clients. She might not read poetry anymore, but she doesn't need to. She knows power flows not from knowledge, but from information. It's easy to forget in all this that the clients have a hierarchy too. A courtesan isn't just judging you by your clothes or your wallet. She's calculating your rank, your influence, your usefulness. A bored duke might get a smile, a visiting scholar might get a poem. A tax collector with authority over local fines. He might get everything he wants, whether she wants it or not. Now here's a particularly bizarre little detail. Some brothels issued rank cards to their top girls. Small wooden or ivory plaques engraved with her name, title and availability. Clients would bid on the cards during festivals or holidays. Possessing the card didn't guarantee a night with her. It guaranteed the possibility of a night. Think of it as the worst kind of lottery ticket. Expensive, exploitative, and yet deeply popular among the elite. There were also rivalries. Bitter, often violent ones. Courtesans fought for rank the way palace concubines fought for the emperor's gaze. Accusations of theft, backstabbing, secret affairs with patrons, all of it happened behind those painted doors. Some women sabotaged others' performances, some seduced clients out of revenge, some just disappeared, and no one asked why. You're starting to realise this isn't just a job, it's a battlefield with rouge instead of blood, hairpins instead of swords. And still, scholars argue about how much power these women had. Some say the Yiji were proto-feminists, women who refused marriage, supported each other, even mentored younger girls into independence. Others call that romantic nonsense. After all, no matter how educated or talented, they were still property. Their contracts could be sold, their bodies negotiated. Their fame used to advertise the house, like a famous chef in a restaurant that never lets him eat. But maybe, just maybe, both are true. A Yiji might gain influence in her prime. She might host gatherings where ideas spread faster than wine. She might advise ministers, critique policy in a metaphor, or fund a scholar's career in exchange for a whisper of freedom. But it's all timed. By 30, she's aging out. By 40, she's invisible. Unless she becomes a madam, which requires money, luck, and the ability to outlive your rivals. Tonight you walk past a different house, smaller, less refined. A girl sits at the window combing her hair by lantern light. She's singing quietly. You recognise the tune. It's a lullaby, not a love song. Her face is blank. Not set, not joyful, just empty, like she's waiting for something that will never arrive. Maybe she was once a top girl. Maybe she never made it that far. In this world there are 1,000 beginnings, but most endings look the same. You keep walking, past the perfume, past the painted fans, past the world that pretends it's all beauty, when really it's all survival. You're sitting in a garden tonight, not a public one, not the kind with stone lions and cherry trees planted for decoration. This one's tucked behind a high-walled brothel, accessible only through a side door guarded by a boy no older than 15, barefoot and bored out of his mind. He lets you through with a grunt. Clearly, someone else arranged this meeting. Maybe a favour owed, maybe a bribe paid. You don't ask. In the soft, lantern-dappled dark, you meet a Yiji. Not just any either. This is one of the famed courtesans of her era. Her name is Lotus Red, and if you were anyone important, you'd already know it. She greets you with that same subtle smile you've seen 100 times in the pleasure houses, but hers doesn't feel forced. It feels dangerous. She's a woman who knows the value of her time, and she's about to charge you in a currency far more complicated than coin. She doesn't sit right away. She walks instead, slow and deliberate, along the stone path winding through the pond. Koi fish drift beneath lily pads, moonlight spilling across their scales like silver threads. She finally pauses under a willow, gestures to the bench beside her, and begins to speak, not about sex or money or even poetry. No, she tells you about court life, because that's where her real business is done. You thought courtesans only worked in tea houses and pleasure quarters, but the elite Yiji, the truly gifted ones, were sometimes invited into far more exclusive salons. Private gatherings where scholars, ministers, and nobles exchanged more than poems. Political strategies, factional gossip, even subtle critiques of the emperor himself floated behind closed doors, passed along with cups of plum wine. And guess who heard it all? The courtesans. They weren't just entertainment. They were intelligence hubs with painted faces and perfect posture. In a society where women weren't allowed to hold office or own property freely, some of them wielded a different kind of power, one draped in silk and dipped in ambiguity. Lotus Red tells you of one such night, a party thrown by a minor prince attempting to rise in the emperor's favour. She was summoned not just to perform, but to listen. She sat among men drunk on their own futures, whispering half-plans and overconfident boasts. Later that night, she relayed what she heard to another client, a minister she trusted, or perhaps feared. That bit of information led to the prince's political downfall. Lotus Red doesn't say it with pride. She says it like someone reciting a weather report. This is the reality few dared speak of. Yiji could be spies, messengers, or even kingmakers, if only for a moment. But of course there was danger in this game. Too much knowledge could get you killed. Misquote a line from the wrong poem, reveal a name at the wrong time, and you could vanish before the next moonrise. It happened often enough that some courtesans carried coded poems, meant to be interpreted only by specific officials. Others simply vanished into monasteries, or worse, ended up displayed in public squares as a warning. Beautiful mouths should not speak dangerous truths. Still, their influence seeped into literature, painting, even policy. Some emperors kept Yiji as unofficial advisors, inviting them to court under the guise of entertainment, then pressing them for insight others wouldn't dare to voice. Of course, once that emperor died or changed moods, the courtesan's power vanished like incense smoke. Revered one moment, disposable the next. There's a quirky record, true or not, who knows, about a courtesan who allegedly convinced a general to call off a battle by composing a tragic love poem. The general, reportedly moved to tears, declared he would rather weep for lost love than drown in blood. Historians debate whether it actually happened or whether it was just poetic license. Either way, the story survives, which in a way is its own kind of victory. Lotus Red isn't interested in historical debates. She switches subjects abruptly and asks if you know how to fold paper cranes. You admit you don't. She scoffs, then pulls a silk napkin from her sleeve and starts folding with practiced ease. All women learn to fold, she says, but we're not allowed to fly. You sit in silence a while. The garden is still. The koi fish circle like lazy spirits, the willow branches swaying above them. It's hard not to feel like you're inside a dream, or someone else's memory. Then she asks if you want to see her book. She means her client book, a small leather-bound ledger hidden inside a hollowed-out wall behind her quarters. Inside, each name is written in beautiful calligraphy, no dates. Just names. Some are crossed out, some are circled, some are marked with tiny drawings, a plum blossom, a snake, a coin. She doesn't explain the symbols. You don't ask. You recognize one name, a high-ranking official known for his piety. You raise your eyebrows. She smirks. He likes his wine warm and his lies cold. That ledger is her life's work, not the performances, not the poetry, the names, the knowledge, the leverage. She knows secrets that could ruin reputations, topple careers, maybe even destabilize entire regions. And yet, she holds it all in silence. Why? Because to speak it would be to die. You're beginning to understand why some of the most powerful men in China feared courtesans more than rebels. A rebel waves a sword. A courtesan writes a poem that makes a man want to lay his sword down. And yet none of this grants her safety. One accusation, witchcraft, betrayal, immorality, could erase her overnight. The state often tolerated courtesans, even taxed them, but they also knew the power these women carried in their perfume-soaked robes. That tension, tolerated but watched, praised but punished, was a line Lotus Red walked every day. You ask her if she's ever been in love. She laughs. Then she says, "Love is a lie we sell to men who can't afford truth." And just like that, the conversation ends. She stands, slips back through the willow curtain, and disappears into the shadows of her own house. You're left alone on the stone bench, or surrounded by koi and moonlight and the sudden realization that everything you thought you knew about courtesans was wrong. They weren't just women in silk rooms, they were the hidden architects of conversation, power and destruction, and no one ever saw it coming. You return to the pleasure quarters a few nights later, this time not to speak with a legend or peek behind the curtains, but just to observe. You're beginning to understand that every gesture, every glance carries weight here. The fan fluttering over a woman's lips isn't just to cool her, it signals which client she's willing to speak to. The way a musician plucks her guqin isn't random. She's adjusting her tempo depending on who enters the room. This place isn't a brothel. It's choreography. It's strategy. It's performance, bleeding into survival. You sit near the edge of the room, where the shadows are thick and no one expects you to speak. Tonight's entertainment is a formal affair. A visiting official from the capital has arrived, his entourage large. His coin purse heavier than a sense of morality. He's dressed in dark robes trimmed with gold and reeks of fermented plum wine. He doesn't even glance at the women as he takes his place on the central cushion. That indifference, that's power. One by one, the courtesans begin to perform. Not all at once, oh no, never. Everything here is sequenced for maximum effect. The youngest starts first, playing the flute softly as the room hushes. Then an older girl begins to sing, her voice like water poured into moonlight. It's a famous Tang love poem, but she's changed the last line, turning it from longing to loss. No one corrects her, no one dares. When the final performer enters, the room leans forward. Her name tonight is Frost Petal, and from the way the madam's eyes narrow, you can tell this performance matters. Maybe it's a test, maybe it's her moment to rise, you can't be sure. She doesn't bow, she simply sits down, picks up her pipa, and begins to play. Now, if you've never heard a pipa live, it's hard to describe. It's like thunder disguised as a whisper. She plucks and strums in a style that makes the instrument speak, not just musically, but emotionally. The melody starts soft, as if she's telling a secret, then swells suddenly like a heart breaking. Her fingers blur with speed, then pause on a single aching note. You feel it in your chest. But it's not just the music, it's her expression. She's not performing for applause, she's performing for someone who isn't even in the room anymore. Maybe someone who never was. There's grief in her gaze, controlled, sharp, and unspeakably beautiful. The official claps slowly. He's not a man who appreciates music, you can tell. He appreciates dominance, and he likes to see people bend, and he waves Frostpetal over. She moves with grace, kneeling beside him, eyes downcast. But she doesn't smile. That's when things shift. He says something under his breath, and she responds, barely audible, but firm. The room freezes. You sense it even before the madam rises, a smile fixed on her face like armour. A servant rushes forward with wine. The moment is smoothed over. The music resumes. But you saw it. A refusal. Small, but unmistakable. Here's the problem with becoming good at your job in this world. People stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as property with talent. And the more you shine, the more people feel entitled to your light. Frostpetal's move was subtle but dangerous. She'll pay for it. Maybe not tonight. Maybe not visibly. But it'll cost her in coins withheld, clients reassigned, cold water baths instead of hot. This house doesn't tolerate disobedience. Not really. The show must go on. What's strange is that moments like this were never rare. Behind the polished veneers of these performances lived a constant negotiation between presentation and resistance. And sometimes that resistance took the form of a single skipped bow or a line of poetry delivered with just enough venom to make its meaning clear. The high-ranking patrons understood the game too. Some played along, others retaliated. There's a story, half fact, half whisper. of a courtesan during the Song-dynasty who refused to toast a powerful merchant. He paid a bribe to have her relocated to a lower-tier brothel outside the city. She went from performing for scholars to serving wine to drunk gamblers in a room that stank of rice wine and spilled soup. One slip, that's all it took. But not every patron was cruel. Some returned again and again to the same courtesan, drawn by more than beauty. They fell in love, or believed they did. They sent gifts, hairpins, poems, even deeds to land. Sometimes they asked the girl to marry them, and sometimes she agreed. Now here's where it gets tricky. These love stories, rarely happy endings. Marriage to a courtesan was legal but deeply frowned upon. The families of such men, especially wealthy or noble ones, would often intervene, threaten, bribe or humiliate the woman into leaving. Even if the marriage happened, she'd be treated as a concubine at best, never a wife, always second tier, always a reminder of shame, and worse, if a courtesan left her house without fully repaying her training debt, her old madam could legally drag her back. There are records of women being kidnapped from wedding beds, their husbands powerless to stop it. The law favoured the house. The contract always won, yet some tried. They wrote letters, they fled in the night. They used connections, begged former clients, bribed guards. A few succeeded, most didn't. One obscure historical document tells of a courtesan who saved enough to buy her own freedom, not through clients, but through poetry. She published under a male pseudonym, and her verses became wildly popular. Only later did anyone learn who she really was. By then she'd vanished from the brothel, rumoured to have joined a Taoist monastery in the mountains. Whether she found peace is another question. And still, in the face of all this, the show continues tonight. You watch Frostpetal return to her place near the instruments, face blank, back straight. The madame says something quietly and the girl nods. No emotion, no resistance, but you can feel it. The echo of defiance still hums in the air like the fading twang of her peeper. The night ends the way it always does, with wine spilled, coins exchanged, and footsteps soft against lacquered floors. You step back into the alley, the air cooler now. The stars are barely visible through the haze. Somewhere behind you a girl starts to sing again. A new guest, a new lie. And somewhere deeper, a woman remembers the night she played her heart out for a man who didn't even hear it. You wake to the sound of drums, soft, distant, steady as a heartbeat. At first you think it's a dream, or maybe a procession passing through the main avenue. But as you rise and listen, you realise what it really is, rehearsal. Somewhere nearby, behind silk screens and carved walls, a troupe is practising for tonight's Imperial banquet, because when empires grow bored or anxious, they reach for entertainment. And in Imperial China, few distractions soothe the court like a carefully choreographed night of music, poetry, and women trained to never flinch. You drift toward the source of the sound. The streets are just waking, bakers dusting flour from their arms, servants carrying baskets of steamed buns, and messengers ducking under hanging laundry. But as you step into the shadow of the governor's guest compound, everything changes. The noise softens, the smell sharpens. Jasmine, lacquered wood, and candle wax. You've reached the holding quarters for the evening's performers. They're not soldiers, but they've been summoned like troops. Inside the compound, a dozen courtesans prepare like athletes. Hair coiled into intricate knots, robes steamed and perfumed, fingers flexed for guqin strings, lips inked for storytelling. Tonight, they will not be prostitutes. Tonight they will be instruments of state. Because while pleasure houses serve the public, the imperial court demands more: elegance, precision, and absolute discretion. These women are expected to embody the grace of the empire itself. An official, expressionless and robed in pale blue silk, paces the hall. He's the liaison between the brothel and the court, and he treats the women like scrolls to be reviewed and unrolled. He doesn't speak to them, only to the madam, who, by the way, is wearing her most diplomatic smile and standing like her back is carved from stone. This is her biggest event of the month, maybe the year. If one girl falters, the entire house's reputation suffers. The selection process is clinical, the official gestures to each woman in turn. She steps forward, bows, recites a poem. A mispronunciation, she's cut. A wrong tone, cut. One girl's shoe squeaks on the floor. She's dismissed with a flick of a fan. No explanation. No second chances. Finally 7 are chosen. You recognise 2 from nights past. One is Willow-Eye, known for her ability to mimic birdsong with a flute. The other is Painted Dew, who once translated a Sanskrit poem in under a minute to impress a visiting monk. Both now stand in a line, silent, flawless, waiting for transport to the palace, or at least to the banquet being hosted by a provincial warlord who still fancies himself a kingmaker. You slip out before the carriages arrive. You've seen enough to know what's next. The perfumed ride through crowded streets, the hushed entrance through a side gate, the long walk into a hall glittering with gold and sharp with suspicion. Because these aren't parties, these are displays of dominance, and courtesans aren't just guests, they're tools. By dusk you've made your way closer to the palace complex, not inside and of course, you're not that brave or that rich, but you find a place high enough and dark enough to watch the lanterns flicker into life across the rooftops. You can almost hear the laughter, the applause, the calculated flattery. Let's talk about the role these women played at such events. Officially, they were cultural entertainers. Unofficially, they were political grease. The more ambitious a host, the more extravagant the women he offered. The emperor's attention was a prize. Ministers vied for it. And presenting the most talented, most beautiful courtesan was a subtle way of saying, "So, look what I control." But it wasn't just about beauty. A well-placed verse, a perfectly timed joke, these could shift the tone of a meeting, smooth over a failed alliance, or redirect a conversation before it turned fatal. There's one historical record, though it's buried deep in court gossip scrolls, of a courtesan who prevented a civil war with a single metaphor. At a tense banquet between rival generals, she compared them to two dragons circling the same pearl, each guarding it, each refusing to strike because the other would. The room laughed. The tension broke. Whether or not it saved lives is debatable, but the generals left without drawing swords. The woman was never named. This is the part that gets murky, where power and performance blur so completely that it's hard to say who's using who. These courtesans were trained to anticipate needs before they were spoken. If a man wanted poetry, they recited it. If he wanted silence, they became it. If he needed to feel clever, they laughed at his dumb jokes. And when he grew tired, they disappeared like smoke, having done what the empire demanded, kept the peace through practice smiles. But here's the catch. This role, as prestigious as it looked from the outside, came with no protection. A courtesan who performed at a palace one week could be beaten in an alley the next. Her status meant nothing outside the rooms where men drank too much and listened too little. She couldn't petition the court, she couldn't appeal an injustice. If something went wrong, if a noble accused her of theft or insult or simply grew bored, she had no recourse. She vanished. Some scholars argue that these women were among the most influential in Chinese society at the time. After all, they had access to powerful men, often saw them unguarded and shaped their moods. Others push back, saying that influence without protection is just a fancier form of exploitation. Can you really call it power if it can be taken away with a snap of the fingers? And then there's the quiet irony. These same courtesans who moved in palaces, dined on delicacies and debated Confucian ideals, couldn't walk through the market without risking insult or assault. They were praised in private and shamed in public, celebrated in verse, erased in census records. You stay until the banquet's lights begin to dim. Somewhere in that glowing labyrinth, Willow-Eye is probably playing her flute, and Painted Dew is reciting a story that makes old generals weep. They'll be remembered. For a night. Maybe two. Tomorrow someone else will take their place. You slip back into the alleyways, where no one claps and the perfume is thinner. In the quiet, you think of those women. Their backs straight, their smiles precise, navigating a world where beauty buys attention, and attention is always a double-edged sword. You've been walking longer than you planned. The sun is gone, replaced by the faint shimmer of oil lanterns lining the quieter paths of the eastern quarter. You're in a less polished part of town tonight, closer to the warehouses, where grain and silk change hands under tight contracts and looser morals. Fewer carriages here, fewer lanterns, but somehow the air feels more honest, less powdered, less rehearsed. The building you approach is easy to miss, no signs. Just a small wooden door painted red at the bottom, where years of footprints have faded it to a dull pink. Inside it's darker, quieter than the other houses you've seen. Not empty, just muted. You're not here for entertainment. You've come to hear a story, from a woman they call Sparrow Ink. No one knows if that's her real name. Probably isn't. But the nickname stuck because she writes everything down, every night, after the final curtain falls and the wine has run out and the guests have either left or passed out on the pillows. She sits alone and writes. Not poetry, not letters, not any more. She writes what she hears. You find her sitting in a narrow room lined with scrolls and tattered cushions. Her hair is mostly silver now, but pulled back neatly. Her robe is simple, and so is her gaze. Calm, sharp, like someone who's watched too many things happen in silence. She doesn't greet you. Not exactly. Just nods, then gestures to a seat across from her. You want stories? She says, her voice dry like old paper. Fine, but they're not yours to keep. And then she begins. She tells you about the ones who weren't just lovers, or performers, or political pawns, but spies, women who were hired or forced to gather secrets while pretending to flirt. Sometimes they worked for rival officials, sometimes for foreign traders, and sometimes for the Imperial Secret Service itself. A courtesan could slip questions into casual conversation. She could notice what names were dropped after too much wine, or what maps a man carelessly left unfolded beside his cup, and no one suspected her. Because who listens to the woman pouring the tea? Sparrow Ink leans forward, elbows on the low table. I once knew a girl, she begins, who memorized the location of a rebel stronghold after seducing a commander. She didn't need to steal the documents. She just glanced at them while he slept, drew them from memory on rice paper, and passed them along with a fan. That fan started a campaign that burned 5 villages to the ground. You ask what happened to her. She died of a fever, Sparrow says too quickly. No reward, just a footnote. This is the world behind the fan. You'd thought courtesans were symbols, tragic, beautiful, mistreated, and they were, but some of them were also architects of betrayal, saviours in disguise, or manipulators so deft you'd thank them for the blade as they slipped it between your ribs. She tells you another story, one you weren't ready for. A client, a scholar of some minor importance, who used to brag that he could make a woman fall in love with a single conversation. He paid for the same courtesan every week, never touching her, only talking. He asked philosophical questions, played mental games. She played along, of course she did. But one night she gave the wrong answer. Or maybe the right one, depending on who was listening. She asked him a question. Would you still want me, she'd said, if I was smarter than you? He never returned. Weeks later, his essays were banned. A quiet purge followed. Sparrow doesn't say how the two things connect, but her eyes do. There are small strange facts scattered through her stories, like the brothel that kept pigeons, trained to carry messages between districts, bypassing censors and checkpoints. Or the courtesan who could tell a man's social rank by the smell of his breath. Garlic meant peasantry, cloves meant imported wealth, opium, complication. One story sticks with you more than the rest. A courtesan fell in love with her client, real love, Sparrow insists, though she snorts when she says it. The man promised to free her, to marry her, to move to a village and live in peace. Classic story, except it almost worked. He forged the papers, paid the madam, even secured a transfer that let them leave the city. They made it as far as the river. Then he got cold feet. He returned to the capital alone. She didn't. Some say she drowned herself. Others say she joined a bandit camp upriver, ran messages between outlaws for revenge. No one knows, but once a year, on the riverbank, a poem appears, written in a woman's hand, folded inside a jar weighted with a stone. Sparrow shrugs. Probably superstition, she says. But there's something in her tone that says she's read those poems, maybe even collected one. The debate over women like her, over what they were, what they could be, never ends. Were they spies? Artists? Victims? Criminals? The truth refuses to stay still. Historians argue in circles. One school claims they were tools of a patriarchal machine. Another insists they found loopholes in the system, shaping empires from the margins. Sparrow doesn't argue. She just keeps writing. Her scrolls aren't kept in order. They're not labelled or categorised. But if you look long enough, you'll see patterns, names repeated across years, districts, disguises. The same girl, different titles. The same man, different sins. It's not just history, it's evidence. A memory palace made of ink and sorrow. You ask her why she records it all, she looks at you long and slow. Because someone has to remember the women no one wants to remember. Then she laughs, dry, brittle. Besides, what else am I going to do? Knit! You leave just before dawn. The sky is beginning to soften, that dusty grey before the pink arrives. The street is still empty. Quiet. But something inside you has shifted. You thought this world was about seduction. Silk and size. Now you know better. It was always about survival. and silence, and the ones who kept the most secrets were the ones no one ever asked. You're back in the heart of the city, wandering aimlessly through its cracked cobblestone arteries when you stumble into a district known among locals as the Green Tower. It doesn't actually have a tower, never did, but the name lingers, soft and poisonous, like perfume soaked into old wood. Some say it started as a mistranslation of a poem. Others say it was slang for the pleasure quarter's tallest brothel, now long gone. Either way, the phrase has become shorthand for something shameful and sweet, an entire system of desire, debt, and denial, bundled into 3 polite syllables. You can feel it as soon as you cross into the Green Tower streets. Everything here is a bit too quiet. The windows are too clean, the paint too fresh, the people too careful. You realise that while the pleasure houses are technically legal, the Green Tower lives in a space just to the side of the law, tolerated, taxed, but officially invisible. A beautiful embarrassment no one wants to talk about, but everyone knows the address of. You pass a row of shops selling lacquered combs and opera masks. On the surface, it's just commerce. But if you look closer, you'll notice which shopkeepers turn their signs backward when a certain client passes, or which alleys suddenly grow louder when the city guard walks by. Everything's coded here. A single red tassel above a door? That's not for luck, it's a signal. A curtain drawn halfway? That's not indecision, that's negotiation. In the Green Tower, language folds in on itself. You don't call it prostitution, you call it singing girl service or flower arrangement. You don't call it a brothel, it's a tea house with atmosphere. The madam is a caretaker, the courtesan is a cloud maiden. No one admits what's really happening, because pretending it's something else is what keeps the doors open, and the shame manageable. The name Green Tower itself became a euphemism over time. Poets used it to imply longing or regret. Officials whispered it as a warning. Mothers used it as a threat: study hard or you'll end up in the Green Tower. It wasn't a place, it was a consequence. And yet not everyone saw it that way. You find yourself outside a modest house near the edge of the quarter. It's older than the others, sun-bleached and leaning slightly. A paper sign flutters in the window. Storyteller, private recitals. You step inside and are greeted not by a madam, but an old man with a glass eye and a limp. He waves you in with a stained fan and pours you bitter tea without asking. The room smells like dust and chrysanthemum. He used to work here, he says, back when it was a proper house. Not flashy, not fancy, just 3 girls and a back room where they could wash in peace. Not all Green Tower houses were like the ones you hear about, he mutters, as if defending a ghost. Some of us did what we had to. Nothing more. He tells you about how courtesans in his house were expected to choose a poem every week, one that matched their mood or their strategy. They would recite it before meeting a new client. A sort of emotional screening. One chose Du Fu, he says, every time, even when it scared the clients away. The implication? Not every woman in the Green Tower wanted to be saved. Some wanted to be understood, and that oddly enough was much harder to come by. There's an odd contradiction in how the Empire treated these women. On one hand, their labour was deeply integrated into urban life, especially in the capitals. Officials partook, poets romanticised them, and local governments quietly collected their taxes. On the other hand, they were socially condemned. A man could rise after spending his youth in brothels. A woman, even the most educated courtesan, could not escape the stigma once marked. There was no reverse path, no redemption arc. Not really. That contradiction bled into art. Some of the most famous Chinese poems of the Tang and Song-dynasties centered around courtesans, but the women in these verses were always ephemeral. They were rain in spring, smoke from incense, flowers blooming just to wither. Beautiful, tragic, never real, never named. Except, of course, they were real, and sometimes they fought back against being reduced to metaphors. There's an obscure but fascinating document, a letter, allegedly written by a courtesan to a patron poet who had immortalised her in verse. She thanks him for the poem, but scolds him for turning her into a symbol for loneliness, when she had simply asked for a loan and a little honesty. Whether the letter is authentic or apocryphal is still debated, but scholars can't help but love it. It's one of the few instances where the muse talks back. You leave the house and wander deeper into the quarter. It's getting dark now. Lanterns flicker on above doorways. Music starts up somewhere distant. A bamboo flute, careful and soft, like someone afraid to wake the past. You pass a woman leaning in a doorway, her makeup blurred from the heat. She doesn't look at you. She looks past you into something you can't see. There's a strange power in this place, one the Empire never managed to tame. The Green Tower has always been a place of contradictions, joy and sorrow, safety and danger, love and performance. You think about the names you've heard, the ones given to the courtesans, Plum Rain, Willow Dream, Red Candle. None of them real, all of them armour. In this world, naming something gives it shape, but it can also trap it. That's the curse of the Green Tower. Everyone knows it, but no one really sees it. Even now, centuries later, the name persists, used to warn, to whisper, to hint. But few know what it actually meant to live behind those painted doors, to laugh like it's your job, to smile while calculating your own exit price. To learn how to disappear before you're ever allowed to truly arrive, you stop walking and sit on the edge of a dry fountain, its stones carved with faded lotuses. You think about all the women who passed through. Here, smart, scarred, beautiful, broken, bored. The ones who were sold, the ones who chose it, the ones who made art, the ones who made noise, and the ones who still, somehow, wait to be remembered. You don't set out to visit a temple, but somehow your feet take you there. Maybe it's guilt, maybe curiosity, maybe you're looking for something clean after spending too many nights in rooms perfumed with lies and powdered sorrow. Either way, you find yourself standing before the Temple of Pure Light, a quiet stone structure tucked between a dyer's workshop and a noodle vendor. It doesn't look like much, but it hums with the kind of silence that makes you lower your voice and tuck your hands behind your back. The nun who greets you at the gate is older than the mountain air, her eyes sharper than any sword you've seen in the capital. She doesn't ask what you're here for, just nods and lets you in. You step across the threshold and suddenly it feels like you've left one world and stepped into another. Everything here is made of simplicity. Smooth floors, clean altars, the faint smell of sandalwood that seeps into your bones. You follow the sound of soft chanting to a courtyard where women sit cross-legged, heads bowed, beads clicking in quiet rhythm. Most are dressed in plain robes, hair shaved or tied neatly, but one of them, just one, is wearing a silk sash that looks suspiciously out of place, too extensive, too red. Later you learn that she wasn't always a nun, she used to be a courtesan. This isn't rare. In fact, throughout the dynasties, temples often became sanctuaries for retired or discarded courtesans, especially those with nowhere else to go. Society might not forgive them, but the Buddha did. And more importantly, the temple didn't ask questions, didn't care how many men you'd entertained, didn't care how many lies you'd told or silk robes you'd worn. It only cared if you could kneel, and keep kneeling. The irony, of course, is thick enough to choke on. Religion often fueled the condemnation of sex work, priests and Confucian scholars railing against moral decay, declaring pleasure houses as pits of sin, and yet the same institutions became the safety nets for women once they were no longer desirable or profitable. You sit beneath a tree while one of the younger nuns sweeps the courtyard. She tells you in a whisper that the silk-sashed woman used to be called Twilight Whisper. Back then she was famous for reciting sutras and love poetry, depending on what her client paid for. Now she barely speaks, just cleans the altar twice a day without being told. The debate among scholars over the moral hypocrisy of this setup is ongoing. Some argue that these temples gave women a dignified exit from a world that offered no retirement plan. Others point out that calling it dignified is a stretch, since most of these women lived out their days in silence and obscurity, hidden behind walls like old furniture. The temple in many ways, became the attic of the empire, a place to put the things no one wanted to look at anymore. You wander through the temple's back rooms and find a small shrine, separate from the main hall. Its wooden beams are worn smooth by time and touch. No one speaks here. You notice the offerings are different. Not fruit or incense, but tiny things. Hairpins, broken combs, scraps of silk folded into shapes. Someone has left a single embroidered shoe, too small for a grown woman, the heel frayed. This is the courtesan's shrine. It's not official. The priests don't talk about it. But it's always here in every temple near a pleasure quarter. Hidden, quiet, but maintained. The women pray to it, not for wealth or beauty, but for peace, for forgiveness, for rest. It's a soft rebellion against the system that let them be used, then shamed them for surviving. There's a story, mostly legend, about a courtesan during the Ming dynasty who became a nun after a patron carved his name into her back in a jealous rage. She escaped the brothel, bleeding and half mad, and collapsed at the gates of a monastery. The monks took her in, nursed her back to health, and allowed her to stay. She spent the next 20 years carving Buddhist sutras into the stone walls with her bare hands. No tools, just fingernails and grit. Some of the etchings remain, though worn and mostly unreadable, like her name, and yet you wonder, was that sanctuary or just a different kind of sentence? Another strange, lesser-known fact. Some temples actually employed former courtesans, not just as nuns, but as keepers of ritual, singers for festivals, even spiritual advisors to wealthy donors. Their training in music and poetry made them ideal for certain ceremonies. Their familiarity with elite circles made them useful intermediaries. In this way, the same society that cast them out found quiet ways to benefit from them again. And always, behind the incense smoke and chanting was the same hard truth. Forgiveness was easier to offer when it didn't cost anything. You return to the courtyard and find Twilight Whisper still scrubbing the altar stones. She doesn't look up. Her shoulders are thinner now. Her hands are raw. You want to say something, anything, but what could you say to someone who's erased herself on purpose? As you step back through the gates, you see a group of children tossing pebbles near the road. One of them points to the temple and whispers to another, "That's where the bad women go." The other child nods, eyes wide. You feel a knot twist in your chest. That's how stories persist. Not through facts, through whispers, through small cruelties disguised as lessons, through the repetition of shame. You look back one last time at the shrine with its quiet offerings, the shoe, the silk, the comb. They look like fragments of a life that never quite belonged to anyone. Like someone broke a woman into pieces and left them behind to pray for themselves. You walk away in silence, because that's the rule here. No one speaks of the Green Tower once it's behind the temple wall, not if they want to be heard again. You're in the merchant quarter now, somewhere near the city's edge, where the streets swell with camels, crates, and the constant clatter of foreign tongues. This is where east meets west, and the Silk Road doesn't end so much as melt into the city's bones. It's loud, overwhelming, chaotic, but beneath all the haggling and spice smoke you feel a strange current pulsing through the crowd. Trade here isn't just gold and goods, it's ideas, it's people, and yes, it's bodies too. You're here because you heard about a brothel that caters to foreigners. Not just exotic in its performances, but international in clientele. Its nickname? The Amber Pavilion. Sounds like a fairy tale, but it's real enough. Tucked between a sandalwood warehouse and a caravanserai that smells like camel sweat and roasted lamb. You find it by following the music. A strange blend of Chinese lute and Persian frame drum. It shouldn't work together. And yet, somehow it does. The madam is already waiting at the door. She sizes you up without smiling and leads you inside, no questions asked. You think you've passed some unspoken test. Maybe you look like you can pay. Maybe you look like you won't cause trouble. Maybe she just doesn't care anymore. Inside, the air is thick with spire, cardamom, cinnamon, incense burned in little bronze cups. The walls are hung with fabrics from India, patterns from Central Asia, lamps from Egypt. It feels less like a brothel, and more like a museum built by someone who's never left home but collects the world through men's pockets. Then you see her, your guide for the evening. Not a courtesan, not exactly. A translator. Her name is Mei Li, though she tells you that in the language of the Kushan merchants it means moonflower. You're not sure if that's true. You suspect she makes up names as needed, languages too. She's part entertainer, part interpreter, part historian, and she knows everything. As she leads you through the house, she explains that foreign traders arriving via the Silk Road often came not just for silk and porcelain, but for women. But not just for sex, though there was plenty of that. They came for stories, for familiarity, for someone who could listen, laugh, and remind them of whatever far-off place they left behind. The Amber Pavilion was designed to feel like nowhere and everywhere at once. Some courtesans here wear Roman earrings and quote Ovid in translation. Others serve fermented mare's milk to Mongolian guests while singing Chinese folk songs with a Western lilt. One girl dances in a blend of Uyghur twirls and Han footwork. It's fusion before fusion had a name. And every movement, every gesture, is engineered to make the foreigner feel like he's found something rare, an echo of home in the eyes of a stranger. Mei Li tells you, quietly, that many of these girls were chosen not for beauty, but for their ability to learn languages. A girl fluent in Persian could earn double. One who could speak Latin? Triple. The pavilion paid for tutors, built private libraries. One courtesan here, nicknamed Inkfish, could write in 4 alphabets and curse in 8. Men loved her for it, or feared her, hard to say which. There's something electric about this place, how cultures collide in candlelight, how every smile is laced with calculation. But it's not all colourful silks and cosmopolitan poetry. Mei Li lets the fantasy drop after your second cup of spiced wine. She tells you about the girl sold by a caravan guide who couldn't pay his debts. He traded her like a sack of grain, said she was too quiet anyway. She ended up here, renamed Golden Fox, trained to greet clients in languages she didn't understand, serving men who looked nothing like the ones from her childhood. You ask what happened to her. Mei Li just shakes her head. Some guests want obedience more than understanding. That's the unspoken truth. Behind all this glamour, the trade of bodies still follows the same brutal math. Girls are bought, taught, renamed. Their pasts erased, their accents polished, their skills monetized. And when they age or falter or refuse, there's always another girl just off the camel train, another mouth to feed, another name to sell. There's a quirky record from the Yuan dynasty, likely true though hilariously vague, that one of Kublai Khan's favourite diplomatic emissaries was a former courtesan who'd worked in a multicultural brothel. She'd learned Turkish, Sanskrit and a handful of European dialects from clients and ended up serving as an intermediary between the Mongol court and visiting emissaries. No one wrote down her real name, but her influence stretched from Persia to Hangzhou, hidden in the folds of silk. And still, even women like her remain tools, not names. The scholars can't agree on what to call these places. Some use hybrid brothels, others cultural houses. A few brave souls even use embassies of desire. What's clear is that these courtesans weren't just navigating gendered power, they were navigating geopolitical power. A well-timed compliment in Arabic could secure a trade deal. A subtle joke in Sanskrit could delay a war. These women didn't just learn languages, they learned diplomacy the hard way. One wine-soaked night at a warm. Later that evening, you sit beside Mei Li on a cushioned bench as she reads aloud from a scroll written by a Greek merchant, half scribbled in a mix of broken Chinese and phonetic Greek. It's a love letter, or maybe a confession, hard to tell. He calls the courtesan the only one who listened, but doesn't mention her name. Of course he doesn't. When she finishes, Mei Li asks you a question. Do you think any of them remembered our names? You open your mouth, then close it again. She smiles. I didn't think so. And just like that, the night dissolves into smoke and silk. You step out into the street, blinking against the lamplight. The laughter inside fades quickly. The street sounds return, the haggling, the drums, the grinding of cartwheels over stone. You look back at the amber pavilion one last time. Somewhere behind its veiled windows, a woman is greeting a man in a language she learned just to survive. Somewhere another is smiling in a dialect that doesn't belong to her, pretending she understands the joke. And somewhere else, a girl is choosing her next name, one that sounds mysterious, desirable, and not at all like who she used to be. You keep walking, because the road moves in one direction, and the girls, they stay. You're back in the capital, wandering a quieter part of the city just past the hour of Ox, when the streets fall still, and the dogs sleep under carts, and even the wind seems too tired to blow. You turn down an alley you don't recognise, your path lit by the soft glow of a lantern barely holding onto its flame. The building ahead of you doesn't stand out. No colourful paint, no music, no perfume. Just a simple wooden door with a golden character etched faintly into the wood. Ming. Name. You knock, more out of habit than certainty, and are met by a woman with greying hair and the kind of eyes that have already measured your worth before you speak. Come in, she says. Not a question, not an invitation. A directive. Inside, the walls are lined with portraits, painted scrolls, faded sketches, even charcoal drawings on silk fans. All women, all faces. Some are stunning, some are ordinary. All of them wear the same expression, calm, deliberate, untouchable. You realise this is not a brothel, it's a memory house. And the woman standing before you? She used to be someone famous. Her name, her real one, she tells you, because she's long past the point of selling mystery, is Qin Ruo. Once the most talked about courtesan in 3 provinces. Now she runs this quiet space far from the music, far from the bidding wars, far from the stage where men used to line up just to hear her laugh. She pours you a cup of bitter chrysanthemum tea and says, "You want to know about fame, don't you?" You nod, because that's why you came. You've heard stories, Rumours of women so famous they inspired fashion trends, started brawls in poetry salons, even earned invitations from the emperor himself. And now you want to understand, how did they rise, and what did they pay for it? Qinruo begins with a name, Li Yuetang. Not a household name now, but during the late Song dynasty she was the woman. Her poems were copied onto fans. Her voice was said to calm the drunk and drive the jealous to madness. She once turned down a provincial governor's marriage proposal publicly and still kept his patronage for 2 years. Now that's talent, Qinruo smirks. But fame was a golden chain. The more beloved you were, the more valuable. The more valuable, the more watched. And if you weren't careful, the house would own you in ways even contracts didn't cover. When a courtesan reached that level of celebrity, she became a brand. The brothel advertised her name. Officials scheduled trips just to see her perform. Young men wrote odes they hoped she'd recite. Everything she did, what perfume she wore, which poem she quoted, which hairstyle she favoured, was copied. The girls beneath her studied her like scripture, and the madam used her like bait. But here's the twisted part. That kind of fame didn't bring freedom. It brought more performance. The top girl couldn't rest. She had to be flawless, or at least seem like it. One sick day and rumours would spread, one drunken mistake and clients would vanish. Another girl was always waiting to rise. Some tried to use their fame to buy their freedom. Qinruo did. She saved for years, investing in textiles through a trusted merchant. When she finally approached her madam to negotiate release, she was told her public value was too high to let her go. The house doubled her debt overnight. There's a record, half-censored as most are, of a courtesan named Yue Lian who became so famous she earned a private residence, gifted by a noble with more coin than sense. She lived alone for nearly 2 years, entertaining only elite clients. People said she was untouchable, immortal. But then the noble died, and his heirs reclaimed the house. She tried to return to her old brothel, but her place had already been filled. She died penniless, her name kept alive only by a single verse carved into a street wall. A peony wilts quicker under applause. Qinruo shows you her own portrait, the one the artist painted during her peak. He made my eyes too wide, she says. And he painted the wrong hairpin. I only wore that one once, but it was the night the magistrate came, so now everyone thinks it was my favourite. This is how myths are born. One moment caught in paint. One poem recited at the right time. One man telling another, "You haven't lived until you've seen her." But fame came with predators. The obsessed patrons, the powerful men who hated to share. One girl, Qinruo says, was poisoned by a client who couldn't bear the thought of her choosing someone else. Another was blackmailed with letters she'd written, turned into scandal scrolls and sold like tabloid gossip. The public devoured their tragedies, mourning them in verse while forgetting their names a week later. The debate among historians is laughable at times. Some praise these women as entrepreneurs, brilliant marketers of themselves in a society that gave them no other tools. Others see them as cautionary tales, but no matter how many footnotes they get, none of the scholars lived what Qinruo lived. The taste of being worshipped and owned all at once. The way your name, once golden, becomes a punchline when you're 35 and tired. Before you leave, she shows you one last thing. A small drawer filled with discarded name cards. Fans, hair combs, trinkets gifted by clients who swore eternal devotion and then vanished. She's kept them all, not out of love, but as evidence. This is what fame buys, she says. Things that gather dust and faces that fade. You step out into the night, the alley behind you swallowing her door like it was never there. The silence feels louder now. You realise you've been carrying the wrong idea in your head. Fame wasn't freedom. It was a spotlight in a locked room, a cage gilded with compliments, and the louder they clapped, the harder it became to leave. You wake to the sound of a book being slammed shut, not yours. Across the tea house from where you're renting a cot, a group of young students is arguing over something in low, clipped tones. One of them, his scholar's robe hanging crooked off one shoulder, waves a tattered scroll in the air. He's flushed with indignation. "It's fiction," he snaps. "Nothing but scandal stitched into silk." You lean in just enough to catch the title. The Plum Pavilion Diaries. Ah, now you remember. It's banned. Or at least it was. Like most banned books, copies still drift from hand to hand like secrets. Pages wrapped in plain cloth. Names scratched out in black ink. past in exchange for silver, favours or silence. And the Plum Pavilion Diaries is infamous. Not because it's obscene, though yes, it has its moments, but because it claims to tell the real stories of courtesans. Unfiltered, unapologetic, dangerous. You wait until the students leave, then ask the innkeeper if he has a copy. He pretends not to hear you, but later that night, when the other guests are asleep, he slips you a bundle wrapped in rice paper and tied with fraying twine. He doesn't say a word, just nods and disappears back into the kitchen. You open it alone by lamplight. It's not what you expect. The book is written in alternating voices, first-person accounts from courtesans in different parts of the empire. Some are told like confessionals, others read like diary entries. A few are stylized, lyrical, dreamlike, but the thread tying them together is unmistakable. This isn't art made for admiration. This is memory made out of spite. Survival as literature. One entry describes a courtesan forced to learn swordplay, not for entertainment, but because her brothel was used as a smuggling post, and someone had to protect the goods. Another recounts how a girl poisoned a client carefully over months using herbs disguised as sleep aids. Her reason? He'd killed her sister. The poem he made to mourn her was carved on a wall in Suzhou. She wanted him to die knowing she'd read it, and laughed. There's a famous chapter where a retired courtesan writes her own obituary, claiming all the men who tried to save her were the ones she had to save herself from. She ends with a line that's still quoted in whispers by women who've read the book in secret. I was never lost. I was never yours. But what makes the Plum Pavilion Diaries so dangerous, so ban-worthy, isn't the sex or the violence or even the revenge, it's the honesty. For once, courtesans aren't symbols. They were not metaphors for fleeting beauty or footnotes in a nobleman's biography. They are whole, petty, vengeful, or clever, tired, hilarious, cruel, loyal, and terrifying. They have names, dozens of them. Names that change as often as the tides, but names they choose. Scholars still fight over the book's authorship. Some say it was written by a collective of retired courtesans, maybe even ghost-written by a sympathetic scholar. Others insist it's fiction, created by a male author with a vivid imagination and a guilty conscience. There are even theories that the entire thing was compiled from intercepted letters, collected by a brothel's bookkeeper who wanted the truth preserved. What no one denies is its impact. After its circulation in the late Ming period, other books followed, some in imitation and some in protest. Pamphlets defending the honour of Confucian virtue. Satirical plays mocking the idea of talking courtesans. One anonymous poet even wrote a response in which he claimed courtesans lacked the stillness of true women, whatever that means, and yet the original text continued to survive, copied in secret, memorised line by line, hidden in the walls of tea shops, behind statues in temples, in the hems of robes. You've heard of it before. Of course, everyone has. But reading it, that's different. Reading it feels like someone gripping your collar and whispering, you don't get to look away. One passage stays with you. A girl named Autumn Vine describes how she pretends to fall asleep during a performance, just to see if her client will whisper something real. She collects these half-confessions like coins, who they envy, what they regret, what they fear. She never uses the knowledge. She just likes knowing more than they do. You realise something halfway through the book. The courtesans aren't just surviving, they're documenting. This is their archive, raw and unofficial. No footnotes, no seals of approval, just pain wrapped in paper, passed like contraband between generations of women who were told to be quiet and decided to write instead. You finish the last page just before dawn. Your fingers are smudged with soot from the cheap ink, and your eyes burn. You carefully rewrap the book and hide it in your own bag. You don't know why, it's not yours, but it doesn't feel right to give it back, and somewhere beneath the initial wave of admiration and sympathy and horror, you feel something else, fear. Because this book doesn't ask you to feel bad for the women. It doesn't want your pity, it wants your reckoning. It reminds you that every time a man wrote a poem about a courtesan's fleeting beauty, she was writing her own story in blood, in silence, or in laughter he never heard. You step out into the early morning air. The city hasn't woken yet, but in your head, 1,000 voices are wide awake, sharp, bitter, brilliant, unforgiving. You were never meant to read their stories, but now that you have, you don't get to forget them. You're back in the centre of the city, watching a small crowd gather around a public board near the magistrate's office. They're squinting up at something freshly posted, an official notice, edges still damp from the paste. heavy with bold black brushstrokes. Another Imperial edict. You know the tone before you even get close. It smells like moral panic and paper. Someone reads it aloud badly. By command of His Majesty, henceforth all establishments engaged in immoral commerce, namely brothels, houses of entertainment and music halls, shall cease operation by the 15th day of the 7th month. You don't even need to finish hearing it. You already know how this ends. You've seen it before. Another ban. Another desperate, performative attempt to legislate decency into a city that thrives on desire. A reminder to the people that morality is a performance, and the Empire always wants to be the lead actor. You make your way toward one of the districts that will be hit hardest. The closures aren't just about prostitution. They target entire ecosystems. Tea houses, music schools, bathhouses, street performers, whole communities built around pleasure are flattened under the same brush. It's less about stopping sex, more about asserting control. A madam you know, Mistress Pei, is already packing. She's not panicked, just annoyed. Her girls are in the back, folding robes, unscrewing hairpins, sorting incense sticks by type. You ask if this edict is different from the last one. She snorts. Every few years they remember we exist. Then they remember how much we pay in taxes. She explains the cycle like she's reciting a poem. Crackdown, protest, quiet bribes, new regulations, eventual reopening. It's like the changing of seasons. The only thing that really changes is which official is pretending to be shocked this time. But the damage is real. Every time an edict is issued, the girls scatter. Some hide in homes, some pretend to be seamstresses or singers, others vanish entirely. The lowest ranking ones get swept up in raids, hauled into jail cells for a few coins of extortion, or sent back to villages they haven't seen since childhood. Families don't take them back. Not once they've been marked. Mistress Pei lost 2 girls last time. One taken by a guard who forgot to file the paperwork. The other thrown into a prison barge bound for labour in the south. She keeps their names written in a tiny ledger in the back of her drawer, along with the days they disappeared. It's the only way I can remember they were real, she says. You ask her how she survives these waves. She shrugs. We hide, we adapt, we lie. Then she grins. We've been doing it longer than the Empire. The truth is, for every law written to protect women, there's another designed to control them. Officially, the Empire outlawed forced prostitution centuries ago. Unofficially, most girls still enter the trade through coercion, poverty, or straight-up sale. The bans do nothing to stop that. If anything, they push it deeper underground, where no one has to pretend to be polite anymore. There's one particularly strange imperial edict from the late Qing dynasty, still debated by scholars, that banned courtesans from using their names in legal records. The goal, apparently, was to preserve the purity of public archives. But it had a cruel effect. Women who tried to report abuse, debt scams, or escape attempts couldn't do so under the names they were known by. And their real names? Lost or forgotten. Which meant their stories, too, vanished into bureaucratic silence. It's a grimly poetic irony, isn't it? The state demands women give up their identities for the sake of appearances, and then punishes them for not having identities when they ask for justice. You step outside Mistress Pei's house as the sun begins to set, and already the district feels quieter. The usual melodies, flutes, lutes, laughter, are missing. Shops are shuttered, lanterns aren't lit. The flower streets have dimmed themselves, preparing for inspection. Even the scent of the air has changed. Less perfume, more fear. You walk past a group of men arguing about the edict. One claims it's about morality. Another says it's a tax strategy. A third laughs and says it's because the magistrate's favourite girl ran off with a poet. Honestly, they all might be right. Because this is the part no one says out loud. These laws weren't written to end prostitution. They were written to remind everyone who's in charge. Even in their wording, they're laced with contradiction. They frame courtesans as both dangerous seductresses and helpless victims, corrupting men on one hand and needing protection on the other. It's illegally Ouroboros, and the girls are stuck in the loop. There's one particularly haunting line in the latest edict. To restore the moral character of the capital, all illicit entertainment must be eliminated. You stare at that word. Eliminated. Not regulated. Not reformed. Eliminated. It sounds like cleaning. But what it really means is forgetting. Scrubbing history until only the myths remain. You hear a rumour that night, quiet, whispered between 2 vendors folding dumpling skins. A group of courtesans, defiant, are planning a final performance before the edict takes effect. One last show, open to anyone who dares attend. You know it's real, but amazed, no one says where it'll be. They just say, follow the sound of the drums. You find yourself hoping it happens. Not because you want to be entertained, but because resistance doesn't always come in riots or fire. Sometimes it comes in verse, in a song sung on a stage that shouldn't exist, in a woman who was told to vanish but chooses instead to raise her voice. By the time you get back to your lodging, the notice board is already bare again, torn down, replaced with a new list of market prices. But you remember what it said, and so do the women folding robes by candlelight, so do the madams boiling rice on hidden stoves, so do the ghosts of girls who once stood in doorways, names painted in calligraphy, waiting for men to decide if they were worth remembering. The first thing you notice when you pass through the northeast gate of the Forbidden City isn't the guards or the gold, but the silence. Thick, heavy silence, like someone's holding their breath behind every lacquered screen. You expected grandeur, of course, and you get it. Towering gates, winding corridors, pavilions etched with the blood of 500 years of ambition. But no one ever tells you how quiet the Imperial City is. Power, apparently, doesn't like to shout. It whispers, behind doors, through servants, or from the lips of women no one is supposed to notice. You're not here on official business, obviously. You've slipped in through the back, aided by a clerk with a gambling debt and a nervous eye. You've promised to deliver a parcel, a harmless favour, but the route takes you past one of the lesser courtyards, the kind with more shadows than people. And that's where you see her. She doesn't look like much at first, just another woman in silks the colour of dying orchids, her face painted in delicate strokes, her hair combed to imperial standards, 3 loops, no fringe, but something in the way she holds herself, not submissive but poised, makes you pause. A eunuch bows too deeply as he passes her. A servant girl follows close behind, not leading but trailing like a lady-in-waiting would. You think, this woman isn't a concubine, she's not a wife, she's something else entirely, and you'd be right. You've just seen a Yiji, a courtesan inside the Forbidden City. How she got here is unclear. Most courtesans, even famous ones, never cross into Imperial space. It's taboo. The Emperor's court doesn't mix with entertainment girls, at least not officially. But sometimes, exceptions are made. The story, as it later unfolds for you, begins with an unusual eunuch, high-ranking, trusted by the Emperor. A man who, due to his status and proximity to power, could do things others couldn't. Like sponsor the entry of a courtesan into the inner court. Not as a concubine, which would require official rank, but as a resident artist. A special title created just for her. Her stage name was Lianhuazi, Lotus Paper. No one used her real name anymore. She was famous in the southern provinces, praised for her calligraphy, her riddles, and her ability to mimic a nightingale's call. The eunuch brought her north during a diplomatic lull, possibly to distract the Emperor from a recent scandal involving embezzled silver and a collapsing bridge. It worked. The Emperor was enchanted, not by her beauty necessarily, but by her voice. She recited sutras with the grace of a priestess and debated him on Taoist philosophy late into the night. She didn't try to seduce him. That, ironically, was the seduction. But here's the twist. She never became his lover. Not publicly, not privately. At least not in the way the records suggest. Instead, she became something far more complicated. A political tool. You see, the eunuchs, long resented by court officials for their influence, used Lianhua Zi to shift the balance of power. She was their voice in private chambers. A living cipher. She knew who spoke ill of whom. She knew which advisors stumbled after too much rice wine. She knew what made the Emperor smile and what made him frown. And in an empire where smiling at the wrong joke could cost you your title, that was power. Of course, nothing in the Forbidden City stays quiet for long. Rumours spread. The censors grew nervous. The Empress Dowager reportedly called her the parasite in silk. There were murmurs of witchcraft, of treason, of foreign influence. One minister even accused the eunuchs of conspiring to replace the Empress with a courtesan. Ridiculous. Maybe, but fear isn't picky about details. And so an order was issued. Lianhua Zi was to be removed, quietly, respectfully, sent back to the south with a stipend and a warning. Except she never made it. Her carriage was found overturned 2 miles outside the palace gate, the horses gone, The guard's unconscious. Her body, missing, vanished. Not killed, not buried, just gone. That's where history ends, and legend begins. Some say she escaped into the countryside and joined a sect of Taoist mystics. Others believe she was hidden by the eunuchs, disguised as a boy, serving out her days as a lowly archivist in the Imperial Library. A few say she was never real at all, just a character created by anti-eunuch officials to discredit their rivals. But walk through the northern halls of the Forbidden City on a quiet night, and the older guards will still tell you, half joking, half whispering, about the woman of the lotus voice. They say she appears when the wind picks up, her laughter trailing like perfume. She walks between the pillars of the Hall of Literary Glory, her feet never touching the floor. And sometimes, if the emperor is troubled in his dreams, they say she appears at the foot of his bed, not to harm, not to seduce, but to whisper a single line of poetry before vanishing into moonlight. The scholars still argue, of course. Some say it's impossible a courtesan ever lived inside the court without being officially recorded. Others point to a peculiar set of ink wash paintings stored deep in the palace archives, unsigned, untitled, but all featuring a woman with eyes too sharp for a concubine, too soft for a spy. It raises the question, when a courtesan enters the centre of power, does she become part of the court or does she unravel it from within? You don't know. But as you walk away from the Forbidden City that night, the sky beginning to cloud, you swear you hear it. Just a faint echo. A woman's voice reciting a poem you don't recognise, and you feel it in your bones. She's not gone. She's just waiting. You've been following a rumour for 3 days now. It started with a drunk gambler in a tea house who whispered, "She bought her freedom with a kiss." Then an old seamstress repeated it while mending a sash. Only she said it was with a song. And now you're sitting across from a paper merchant who swears it was neither. It was a contract sealed with a lover's blood. Whatever the truth is, the woman's name comes up every time. Xue, golden embroidery. One of the most legendary courtesans in the southern districts, known not just for her beauty, but for what she did. She escaped, not fled, not vanished, left legally, freely, walked out the front door in daylight, hair neatly pinned, debts repaid in full, the kind of ending that never really happens. You finally find someone who knew her, or at least claims to, a man named Duan, once a lantern painter, now mostly just a drinker with a limp and too much time. You bribe him with dried plums and the promise of listening. He tells you Xue didn't escape because she fell in love. She engineered it. She chose a client, a wealthy silk merchant from the north. Not too young, not too old, not too smart, not too cruel. He was decent, soft-spoken, and predictably lonely. She didn't seduce him overnight. She built it slowly, with long conversations, shared poems, and the kind of gentle detachment that made him think he was doing the chasing. Then, when he was deep enough in the illusion, she offered him a deal. Not romance, not sex, a contract. She would leave the brothel, but not to be his wife. She wouldn't bear his children, wouldn't take his name. Instead, he would buy out her debt, in full, and set her up with a small house, a business license, and 3 years of support. In return, he could visit once a week. No guarantees, no promises, just visits, he agreed. And more shocking than that, he kept his word. She left the brothel, started a modest embroidery shop, and began selling handmade robes to upper-class women who, ironically, had once shamed her profession, but now marvelled at her artistry. She never advertised who she used to be. But she didn't deny it either. If you asked her, she'd say, "I worked in stories, now I work in silk." You ask Duan if she ever fell in love. He shrugs. Not with him. Maybe with herself, finally. It's a rare ending. Almost mythic. Most stories don't go that way. More often, the promise of love is a trap dressed as a key. You've heard too many variations. A girl gives up everything for a man who swears he'll marry her. He introduces her to his friends. Swears he's different. Buys her trinkets, starts calling her by her real name. For a moment, she believes. And then one day he vanishes. Or worse, returns, with a wife, a guilt-stricken apology, and an envelope of hush money. In some cases, the girl goes back to the brothel. In others, she doesn't survive the betrayal. There's an old saying among madams, "A courtesan's love is a borrowed robe. It fits until the feast ends." Even when a girl does escape through romance, it's rarely a clean cut. If her debts aren't paid, the brothel can demand her return, even years later. Some houses keep ghost contracts on record. Agreements extended indefinitely by mysterious new charges: laundry, broken dishes, training fees. A favourite tactic, the dowry fine, an invented fee for lost potential profits when a courtesan marries out. You learn about one such woman from a court petition dating back to the late Qing dynasty. She married a low-ranking official who had barely scraped together the funds to buy out her contract. Years later, the brothel came calling, claiming she still owed for 2 years of singing lessons and one silk robe damaged by tears. The case dragged on until the man died of illness. She was forcibly returned, now in her 30s, considered too old to perform. She was reassigned to kitchen labour. She died within the year. But some fought back. There's a fascinating, little-known archive of anonymous love contracts. Illicit agreements written between courtesans and clients in the margins of books, hidden inside fans, stitched into garments. Promises to elope, to start anew. Some are written in poetry, others in clumsy prose. Most never came true, but they exist. You find one in the private collection of a retired magistrate smuggled in a hollow scroll rod. It reads, "If I leave, it will be with no fanfare. If you follow, do not knock. If you find me, do not speak my name. If you love me, leave me alone." Not exactly romantic, but maybe that's the point. Because love, in the world of courtesans, was always complicated, performative, conditional. Love was a game you played with rules that changed mid-hand. The house could use it to control you. Clients could use it to buy pieces of you weren't selling. And even if the love was real, which sometimes rarely it was, it didn't protect you. Still, women like Xue managed to twist the rules. Not because they were the most beautiful, but because they were the most strategic. They knew what men wanted to feel, desired, seen, saviour-like, and they weaponized that fantasy like a blade hidden in silk. As you leave Duan behind, muttering to himself about the taste of plum wine and the shape of Xue handwriting, you realise he's still in love with her. Or with the version of her he thinks he knew. Doesn't matter, she's gone now. Not vanished, Shuyu, just unreachable. And somewhere, maybe not far from here, she's stitching a robe by lantern light, free, or at least freer than most. Because she figured it out. Love doesn't save courtesans, but sometimes, if you're careful, smart, and just a little cold, it buys the door open. You arrive just before sunset, drawn by music that doesn't sound like music at first. It begins as a slow tapping, almost hesitant, like someone testing a drum they've owned for years but haven't dared to play. Then a second sound joins in, sharper, tighter, the string of a guqin plucked with a precision so clean it feels like glass. As the sun slips below the tiled rooftops, more instruments weave in, bamboo flutes, bronze bells, the deep thrum of a peeper echoing through narrow alleys. You follow the sound as if hypnotised, stepping into a world not entirely awake, not entirely asleep. This isn't a brothel, not quite. Tonight it's something else. The door you pass through is carved with clouds and cherry blossoms, polished until your reflection ripples across the wood. Inside, a long corridor lined with lanterns leads you to a courtyard open to the darkening sky. No gaudy signs, no barkers calling out prices, just that music swelling and dipping like the ocean breathing. Welcome to a performance night. These weren't held every night. They were rare, selective, and deeply coded. The clients invited were carefully chosen, not necessarily by wealth or status, but by the subtle currency of behaviour. Men who knew when to laugh quietly, when to look but not touch, when to admire from a distance. A courtesan who could control her crowd without a single word, that was mastery. You take a seat near the back on a red cushion that still smells faintly of wine. The space fills slowly. Older men in scholar robes, younger ones trying to imitate them. A few women too, wives of officials or curious aristocrats who could attend under the excuse of cultural education. No one claps. There's no stage. Just a cleared square of stone where shadows stretch long and careful across the floor. And then she steps into view. Tonight she's known only as Moon Orchid. You've heard her name before, drifting like incense from one house to another. Her specialty isn't poetry, it's presence. She doesn't perform so much as haunt the room. Every motion is deliberate, every expression calculated for effect. She doesn't wear the loud reds or the deep purple as typical of the high-ranking courtesans. She's dressed in pale green silk that shimmers like dew, her hair combed into an asymmetrical bun that whispers rebellion to anyone paying close attention. She begins with a poem, but not her own. It's an old piece, Tang dynasty, familiar, safe. But her delivery strips the comfort out of it. She slows certain words, lets others slip away like something unsaid. You realise halfway through that she's not reciting it for you. She's reciting it at someone, a specific someone in the crowd. You scan the room but can't tell who. That's part of the game. Then comes the dance. Not the chaotic, bawdy kind used to loosen coin purses. This is ritual. She moves in circles, trailing a fan in each hand, the silk catching the breeze just enough to make her seem like she's being pulled rather than moving. Her feet glide over the stones without sound. The room holds its breath. Every guest leans forward just a bit, afraid to blink. And then the music stops, abruptly, mid-chord. The silence is louder than the song. She kneels, fan still held wide, and bows, not deeply, not submissively, but like a challenge. The kind of bow that dares the audience to misunderstand her. Later you speak with one of the musicians, an old man with fingers like gnarled tree roots. He's been performing for courtesans for over 30 years, he says, has seen hundreds of women rise and fall, but Moon Orchid knows how to vanish before they can touch her. That's the key, he says. It's not about being beautiful, it's about being unreachable. There's an odd detail he shares, something that sticks with you. Before every performance night, the house sprinkles osmanthus water on the stones, not for scent, but to catch the footprints of any drunk or disrespectful client. If a footprint crosses the performer's path, they are quietly blacklisted. No fuss, just never invited again. Performance nights were always more than entertainment, they were tests. Stages for hidden negotiations, a way for courtesans to remind the elite that while they might be for sale, their dignity wasn't. One particular case from the Song dynasty is still referenced in whispered circles. A courtesan known only as Jade Cicada used her performance night to indirectly expose a corrupt official. Her poetry described a stolen land deed, her costume colours mirrored the province's stolen seal, and the tune she sang matched a banned political ballad. Most of the audience didn't notice, but one man did, and within a week that official disappeared from court records. Scholars argue about it endlessly. Some say it's all apocryphal, others insist it was coordinated through underground channels, a kind of coded resistance wrapped in lace and lanterns. But if you ask any older courtesan, they'll smile and say, "Course she did, what else is a stage for?" You return your gaze to the courtyard. The performance is over. Moon Orchid is gone. Not vanished dramatically, just slipped behind a screen while the crowd was still blinking in the afterglow. There's no applause, applause is vulgar. Instead, guests quietly place offerings into the small lacquered boxes near the exits. Poetry scrolls, jade pendants, rare teas, tokens of appreciation, unspoken hopes of future speechen. As you rise to leave, you catch a trace of the osmanthus scent in the air. Sweet, sharp, faintly bitter. You understand now what these nights meant. They weren't just entertainment, they were reclamation. In a world where courtesans were touched, purchased, silenced and discarded, here they ruled for an hour or two. They decided the script, chose the gaze, and if you were lucky, you got to watch them set the room on fire without ever lighting a match. And when it was over, they vanished again, like dreams that left perfume behind. There's a particular smell in the air tonight. Not the soft perfume of jasmine or the ceremonial incense you've grown used to. This is sharper, heavier, a mix of burned herbs, dried citrus peel, and something faintly sour that sits in the back of your throat like an unspoken truth. You recognise it now, it's the scent of a brothel apothecary, the kind of place that sells both cures and comforts, and often just hope in powdered form. You're standing inside a small windowless room tucked behind a pleasure house you've visited before, though you never noticed this part of it. The door was always closed. Tonight it's open, and inside a woman in her 40s, no makeup, no robe, just an apron stained with oils, grinds something with a mortar and pestle that looks a little too red to be medicine. Her name is Xiao Fan, and she used to be a courtesan. Now she's the in-house healer. Not a doctor exactly. She's not officially licensed by the Imperial board, but no one in this district cares. She's who the girls come to when something's wrong, when they're too tired, too sick, too scared to go to the real doctors who would just ask too many questions and report the answers. On the shelf behind her is a silent museum of every ailment courtesans ever learned to fear. Bruised ribs, inflamed skin, fatigue, fevers, bleeding, trembling hands. Vials labelled in tiny calligraphy, powders wrapped in rice paper, odd herbs hanging from the rafters like ghosts. You watch as she prepares a small packet for a girl with shaking fingers, no more than 17, who keeps her gaze down the entire time. She hasn't slept in days, Xiaofan says. Client last week liked her better when she cried. You don't ask what's in the packet. You don't ask why she's mixing it into wine instead of tea. Some things you don't need to know. Instead, you ask about the worst of it. She doesn't flinch. Opium, she says, and the fear of pregnancy. Those are the two things that break a girl faster than fists. She tells you how brothels began keeping quiet stocks of herbal contraceptives. Mountain yam, wild rue, boiled leaves so bitter they had to be swallowed with sugarcane juice. But the dosages were inconsistent and the side effects brutal. And when those didn't work, well, there were harsher methods. Blood tonics, they called them. You hear the term and your stomach twists. Miscarriages were common. Sometimes they were deliberate. Sometimes not. Either way, they happened in silence behind painted walls with the girls bleeding into washcloths while another client waited 2 doors down. If they survived, they were expected to perform again by the end of the week. Sometimes they didn't survive. Xiaofan walks you through her private records. Not official ledgers, just scraps of cloth and ink coded so no one could understand them but her. Every mark represents a girl she treated. Some have 3 or 4 symbols beside their name. A few have dozens. She pauses at one. She died in her sleep, she says. No pain. Not from the medicine. Just stopped. You realise it's not only disease that kills in this world. It's exhaustion, despair, a slow decay from pretending too hard for too long. And then, of course, there's the stigma. Diseases carried by courtesans were often labelled as divine punishment. Karma. Proof of impurity. No matter that they were usually contracted from clients, government officials, scholars, military men. No matter that hygiene standards were non-existent. If a girl got sick, it was always her fault, her punishment, her fate. One particularly cruel superstition revolved around the idea of the ghost womb. A belief that courtesans who had too many partners would eventually lose their ability to conceive, cursed to wander life barren and unloved, haunted by the 7 spirits of unborn children. It was a lie, of course, but lies have weight. And this one followed women into temples, into courtrooms, even into marriage if they were lucky enough to escape. Even clients believed it. Some avoided older courtesans, claiming they were drained. Others insisted on virgins, or at least women who looked fragile enough to be believable. The marketplace of desire was deeply tangled with ideas of health, purity and punishment. You could be beautiful and talented and clever, but if you coughed at the wrong time, you might as well have vanished. Xiaofan lifts a jar and shows you something that looks like candied fruit. This is for the madam, she says. Liver problems, too much stress, too much guilt. She smiles. It's not a kind smile. She then gestures toward a faded cloth hanging on the wall. It's stitched with a strange design. Concentric circles surrounded by tiny, spiralling characters. A ward, she explains. Meant to keep ghosts away, especially the ones that come from girls who died with things left unsaid. You've heard these stories before. Hauntings in brothels, rooms that stay cold no matter the season. Doors that rattle without wind. Some courtesans wear protective talismans in their robes, stitched into the lining. Others light incense every night, not for ambience, but to keep the dead distracted. Ghosts of women who died in childbirth, women who drank too much opium, women who slit their wrists in copper bathtubs while their friends sang next door, not hearing a thing. There's a scholar you read once who dismissed all of this as emotional folklore. He said brothel hauntings were just projections of collective guilt. But Xiaofan disagrees. They're real, she says. They're the only ones who don't lie. You ask her why she keeps doing this. Patching up wounds, mixing herbal powders, listening to stories no one else wants to hear. She doesn't answer at first. Then she says quietly, "'Cause someone needs to believe they're still human." Before you leave, she hands you a satchel of dried herbs. Tea, she says, good for sleep and memory. You walk out into the cool night air. The scent of the apothecary still clings to your clothes, bitter and warm. Somewhere behind you, a girl is swallowing something too strong for her stomach. Somewhere else, a woman is trying not to cough in front of a client. And somewhere deeper, in a world you can't see, the ghosts are listening, waiting to be remembered. The city's quiet tonight, but not the comforting kind of quiet. It's the kind that sticks to your skin, as if the walls themselves are listening. You're in the northern ward now, far from the usual music houses and tea salons. No lanterns hang from the doorways here. No one smiles as you pass. This is where performances go to die, where courtesans too bold or too broken are sent to disappear. And tonight, you're here to find a songstress who once made a room fall silent with a single note and then vanished after a single verse. Her name was Pei Hong, or at least that's the name she used on stage. Off stage, no one's quite sure. That's part of the mystery, part of the danger. The story goes that Pei Hong wasn't just talented, she was fearless. She sang poems that no one else would dare recite, political satire, double-meaning verses, songs that played like lullabies on the surface but sliced like knives beneath. She had a voice that wrapped around the truth and made it sound beautiful, which of course made her a problem. You find her not in a brothel or a house of music, but in a barely lit room above a dumpling stall. She lives in shadow now, wrapped in anonymity like an old robe she no longer bothers to fold. The room smells like dried scallions and old ink. A single candle flickers in the corner. Casting her face in and out of the past, you can see it still, that stage presence, like she's waiting for applause even though none will come. She asks if you've come to arrest her. You say no. She doesn't seem convinced. Pei Hong tells her story with a tone that swings between sarcasm and exhaustion. She was invited to perform at a banquet for a provincial magistrate. A big deal, big names, high stakes. She prepared a song based on an old folk tune, but reworked the lyrics. Something about corrupt officials swimming in rice wine while the people starved. Everyone laughed at first. They thought it was clever, even the magistrate chuckled. But someone didn't. A few days later she was accused of spreading subversive sentiment. No trial, no public condemnation, just an overnight raid. Her brothel was fined, the madam beaten, and Pei Hong was made to disappear. The official story was that she died of illness. The reality? She was sold to a lower-tier house in a neighbouring province, not as a courtesan, as punishment. She escaped months later, bribed a guard with opium, stole a scholar's robe, hid in a rice cart, and now she's here, safe but unheard. There's something devastating about watching someone whose voice once ruled rooms now barely raise it above a whisper. I used to make ministers cry, she says. Now I sing lullabies to stray cats. You ask her why she took the risk, why sing that song. She shrugs. I thought maybe, if I made them laugh, they'd forget to be afraid, or at least remember to be ashamed. It's not the first time a courtesan's voice was considered dangerous. Song was one of the only tools they had, and many used it to say what men couldn't or wouldn't. In a society where speech was tightly controlled, music offered a loophole. You couldn't criticise the emperor, but you could sing an old peasant tune about a foolish rooster-crowned king. Everyone knew what you meant. But the censors knew too. During the late Tang dynasty, there was an underground list kept by Imperial agents. Unacceptable verses. Poets were watched, singers even more so. Some tunes were banned outright. Others were subtly punished, singers reassigned, their houses shuttered, their patrons quietly warned. No blood, no headlines, just erasure. Pei Hong shows you a sheet of lyrics she's been working on. It's a children's rhyme, or so it seems at first. The sparrow wears the tiger's coat. He sings until the stars all float, but if the moon should block the sun, he'll chew his tongue and come undone. It's nonsense, until you know that Sparrow was once the nickname of a beloved minister who disappeared after criticising a tax reform, and Tiger's coat refers to the uniform of the secret police. You ask if she plans to perform it. She laughs. Do I look like I've got a death wish? There's a long-standing debate among historians about how much influence courtesans had over political thought. Some argue that they were passive participants, echo chambers for elite men. Others insist they were active provocateurs, shaping narratives from behind painted fans. The truth, like always, is more complicated. What's undeniable is that the state feared them enough to silence them. Pei Hong shows you her collection, scraps of songs never performed, poems too risky to read aloud, verses scrawled on the backs of handkerchiefs and old menus. She keeps them in a wooden box wrapped in silk, a kind of graveyard she calls it. Every girl has one, she says, a place for the words we can't afford to speak. One piece catches your eye, a poem stitched into a silk collar. The thread is nearly invisible, the strokes too small to read without squinting. You ask her why she sewed it there. She shrugs, because even if they strip me, they won't silence me. You realise then what this is really about. Not rebellion for the sake of rebellion, not fame or notoriety. It's about claiming space. Space to speak, to criticise, to mock, to exist as more than a whisper behind someone else's story. As you leave, Pei Hong gives you one last warning. Don't trust applause. It always fades faster than silence. You step back into the night. Her words still in your ears. Somewhere nearby, someone sings off-key in a tavern. Someone else laughs too loudly. But none of it feels as alive as the silence behind you, where a woman sits in hiding, with verses sharp enough to draw blood. And somewhere, in a palace you'll never see, a censor dips his brush in ink, still trying to outrun a song sung once and never forgotten. The fire started in the middle of the night. No warning, no wind. Just the sudden crackle of wood and the thick scent of burning lacquer curling through the air. You were sleeping in a guest room 2 streets over, and by the time you stumbled out, barefoot and half-dressed, the red glow had already swallowed the sky. People were screaming, but not in panic exactly, in disbelief. This place wasn't supposed to burn. Not the Red Plum House. You run toward the heat anyway, instincts overruling caution. The Red Plum was one of the oldest brothels in the city. A tall, graceful structure built on generations of stories. It wasn't just a place, it was a myth in real time. Girls who worked there were considered golden, trained in 5 instruments, 10 dialects, and 100 heartbreaks. It was a sanctuary of sorts, if any place like this could be called that. And now it was turning to ash. By the time you arrive, it's too late. The roof has caved in and the outer walls are glowing with the last red breath of the blaze. A crowd gathers at a safe distance. Neighbours, ex-clients, performers from other houses. No one speaks. The silence is thick, like the smoke. You hear a small sound, could be crying, could be a song, could be the sound of something ending. The girls? Gone. Shattered. Some escaped barefoot into the alleys, faces still half-painted, trailing ribbons and spoke. Others ran with nothing but their names on their lips. One leapt from a second-story balcony, ankle shattered on impact, still clutching her guqin. Another vanished entirely. No one knows if she burned or fled. The Red Plum wasn't just a brothel, it was a hub, a place where stories passed from mouth to mouth, where women traded warnings, where news travelled faster than messengers. And now, it's dust. The city's officials show up at dawn with forced frowns and hollow condolences. They promise rebuilding efforts and emergency housing, but you see it in their eyes. They're relieved. One fewer symbol of everything they pretend doesn't exist. You help sift through the wreckage the next day. Ash clings to your skin. The air smells of charred silk and hair oil. You find bits of jewellery melted into shapes you don't recognise. A comb, half a shoe, a fan scorched to black, its poem erased by flame. No one can agree on how the fire started. An oil lamp left too close to a curtain, a jealous client, a rival madam, a cooking accident. Some whisper it was deliberate, a cleansing, a warning. You meet one of the survivors near the river a few days later. She's wrapped in a borrowed robe, her fingers stained with soot, her voice hoarse from breathing smoke and shouting names. Her name is Xiaolan. She worked on the 2nd floor. She tells you the fire wasn't the worst part. The worst part, she says, was seeing what happened after. In the wake of the fire, displaced courtesans had nowhere to go. Some were taken in by rival houses, on the condition they agree to steeper contracts. Fewer rights, more clients. A few girls were sold outright, their debt now property to be shuffled around like coin. Others ended up in taverns, inns, or worse, alone. One girl was found sleeping under the city bridge, her hair still braided in performance curl. She wouldn't speak, just hummed the same 4-note melody over and over again until someone recognised it as a Red Plum lullaby. That's when the rebels started noticing. See, it wasn't just the courtesans who were affected. The Red Plum had served as a shadow network for messengers and sympathisers. Courtesans weren't only singers, they were eyes, ears. Their homes weren't just places of pleasure, they were maps coded in flirtation and fragrance. When the Red Plum burned, the rebels lost an entire communication channel. A woman could pass a message in a flower's arrangement. Now, that flower was gone. There's a tale from the mid-Ming period, part documented, part whispered, about a rebellion in the southwest province that failed by a matter of hours. Historians chalked it up to poor planning. but oral accounts blame the sudden destruction of a brothel that housed their main informant. They say she died in the blaze with the map stitched into her robe, trying to reach the man who never showed. Xiaolan tells you that the fire made one thing clear. No place, no matter how long-standing, is safe. These houses, she says, they feel permanent, but they're only real if someone keeps paying. It's true, brothels may look grand, but they're paper palaces, fragile, flammable, and easily erased. The moment they're inconvenient, they're gone. The women inside, scattered like embers. There's an open scholarly debate about the role of brothel fires in urban development. Some claim they were accidents, others suggest they were tools, convenient resets for neighbourhoods eager to sanitize their image. Fire cleared space, fire erased records, fire let the city pretend nothing ever happened, and in every case the women carried the cost. You visit the remains of the Red Plum House one final time before the city clears the lot. Grass has begun to poke through the ash. A few charred beams remain, black fingers reaching into a grey sky. Someone's left offerings at the edge. A ribbon, a string of bells. A single unburned poem scroll pinned beneath a stone. You don't touch it. You just sit for a while imagining the sound of laughter once heard here, of instruments tuning, of a girl humming through her nose while powdering her neck. The city moves on quickly. A wine shop takes the space within a month. The name? Red Plum Wines. The irony doesn't even sting, it's too expected. But the women, they don't forget. They scatter like ashes on the wind, carrying the weight of what was lost and what was taken. Some disappear forever. Others rise again, under new names, new houses, new rules. And maybe years from now, someone will mention the Red Plum in passing as a legend, a rumour, a tragic tale. But you'll remember, because you saw it burn, and you know it wasn't just a building, it was a life. You hear the name first in passing, wrapped in a sneer from a drunk merchant slumped across a tavern table. Peony's gone soft, he says, slurring into his rice bowl. Old age or too much poetry, who knows? His friend laughs, sharp and bitter, and then mutters something about that damned plum blossom stealing all the good clients. That's how the story always starts. Two names, one echoing like silk, the other like steel. Peony and Plum Blossom, the rivalry of the decade, or at least that's what the gossip scrolls call it. You ask around, curious, and have met with immediate interest. Every performer, madam, did and house servant has an opinion. Peony was elegance, drama, romanticism, voice like a temple bell. Plum Blossom was wit. Fast, sharp, unbothered by rules, always one word ahead of the room. They were opposites, they were mirrors. They hated each other, they respected each other. They might have even been in love, depending on who you ask and how many cups of wine they've had. At their peak, both women commanded the highest rates in the city. Peony wore soft pinks and carried a fan inscribed with her own calligraphy. She could cry on command and was rumoured to write verses that made even the jaded ministers blush. Plum Blossom favoured bold reds and told stories that left audiences laughing with one line and silent with the next. Her fans didn't weep, they lingered, hoping for one more clever insult or an accidental smile. They worked in different houses, naturally. Houses that had once cooperated now became battlegrounds, throwing themed parties, offering new music, copying each other's hairstyles and tea blends. Clients began choosing sides like it was a political campaign. Peony's admirers considered themselves refined, traditional, drawn to her poetry and tragic grace. Plum Blossom's crowd was younger, sharper, more rebellious. They claimed to love her for her honesty, though, honestly, they loved being insulted by a woman who didn't need them. And then came the scandal. It started small, as these things do. A shared patron, a minor noble who fancied himself a connoisseur of women, art and drama, in that order. He began visiting both houses, spending money, writing poems, making promises. Typical behaviour. But then he did something no one expected. He commissioned a duel, not with swords, with words. A duel of verse to be performed at a private party with only a dozen elite guests and one very anxious tea server taking notes in the corner. Peony versus Plum Blossom, tradition versus rebellion. The loser would, by custom, be expected to surrender the patron's favour, and maybe a little pride. They agreed. The poems from that night were never officially recorded. The tea server's notes were stolen, but fragments survive, lines whispered down through generations of apprentices and madams. Peony began with a classic verse, beautiful and melancholy. Like rain on a temple roof, your love falls without sound and leaves me cold. Elegant, painful, perfectly tragic. Plum Blossom responded with something different. If love is rain, I prefer a roof with holes. At least it's honest. The room gasped. The noble laughed. Peony, depending on the version, either smiled graciously or shattered her wine cup against the floor. What followed was chaos. Patrons divided. Rumours swirled. Some claimed Peony faked an illness to avoid public embarrassment. Others said Plum Blossom had plagiarised a line from a travelling monk. Scrolls appeared detailing the event, most of them written by men who weren't even there. And in the middle of it all, the two women said nothing. No public statements, no poems. Just silence until, that is, Peony vanished. Gone. No farewell party. No final poem. Just gone. Her room was emptied, her fan left behind, its calligraphy half finished. The brothel refused to comment. Some whispered she'd been sent to a countryside estate by a powerful patron. Others said she'd run off with a scholar. A few claimed she'd retired to a convent after a miscarriage. The most dramatic rumour, that Plum Blossom had orchestrated her rival's disappearance. Plum Blossom said nothing, but her performances changed. She no longer wore red. She stopped telling jokes. Her poems became slower, heavier, less clever, still brilliant, but haunted. One night she ended a performance with a line no one had heard before. I never wanted her silence, just her reply. And then, months later, she too disappeared. There's a theory, obscure but persistent, that they ran away together, faked the feud, staged the duel, and vanished to start a life without contracts, clients, or calligraphy. It's romantic nonsense, probably, but the idea lingers. What's interesting is how the rivalry endured. Generations later, apprentices at brothels are still asked, "Are you a peony or a plum blossom?" The question doesn't mean what it used to. It's about style, approach, weapon of choice, softness or sharpness, tragedy or satire. You visit a retired madam named Wu who worked in both houses during the height of their fame. Her knees are gone now, and her eyesight isn't much better, but her memory, sharp as a guqin string. She tells you, sipping bitter tea, that the whole thing was probably invented. They respected each other, she says, probably more than anyone else did. So why the feud? Men like a fight, especially when they can watch without bleeding. She shows you a letter, unsigned, fade, sealed in red wax. It's brief, just a singleton sentence. "We were never rivals, just reflections." No one knows who wrote it, but Madame Wu keeps it in her drawer like a sacred relic. So maybe the real scandal wasn't betrayal. Maybe it was love, or recognition, or worse, two brilliant women realising they were the only ones who truly understood each other in a world that only wanted them to compete. You leave the house feeling the weight of it. Not just the gossip or the poetry, but the echo of something deeper. A friendship masked as rivalry. A battle that might have been a duet. And maybe, somewhere far from this city, two women still sit beneath a plum tree, sipping tea and composing verses the world will never hear. You're at the edge of the capital now, standing in front of a crumbling ancestral house that looks more like a memory than a home. Its roof sags like a tired sigh, and the garden is overgrown with vines that don't seem interested in stopping. The stone path is cracked, the pond is dry, and the painted shutters, once red, have faded into a sort of dignified beige. You wouldn't be here at all if not for a rumour that's been circling the courts for decades, that one of the most powerful women in the empire once began her life as a courtesan. They say she changed her name, that she erased her past like a poem rewritten until no ink remains, that before she wore the phoenix crown she wore powdered rouge and whispered songs over wine. They also say she had the emperor wrapped around her little finger, which naturally made her dangerous. The house belonged to her cousin, long dead, but the caretakers still keep it open, sort of. You slip the doorman a coin and an apology, and he waves you in without lifting his head. The inside smells like dust, cedarwood, and something older. Not decay, just secrecy. You pass family portraits, each more regal than the last, until you reach the drawing room. There's a painting here, unfinished. A woman seated at a table, her gaze tilted slightly away from the viewer. She's half shadow, half smirk. Her robe is court-style, high-collared, embroidered with cranes, but her hands rest on a fan that doesn't match the rest of the painting. It's too delicate, too familiar. You've seen it before, in an old brothel ledger that listed the belongings of a courtesan named Lian Qiu. That was the name, not the one she used later. Not the one remembered in official records, temple dedications, or imperial edicts, but the name she whispered to her sisters in the pleasure quarters, long before the palace ever looked her way. You start connecting the pieces, the stories. Lian Qiu was a courtesan in the southern districts during the early years of the Yongli Emperor's reign. She was known for her skill in calligraphy and her refusal to flatter clients who didn't earn her attention. That alone made her legendary. She wrote poems that disguised political commentary as heartbreak. And she once corrected a minister's misquote in the middle of a performance, humiliating him so thoroughly that he left the city for a year. Then suddenly she vanished from the brothel where she worked. No trace, not a debt paid, not a contract voided. A year later, a new concubine appeared in the imperial court, educated, serene, with handwriting identical to a poem published anonymously in a banned scroll of brothel verses. Over time she rose, through quiet diplomacy, careful alliances, and a knack for making enemies disappear without scandal. By the time she reached the title of Empress Dowager, no one dared whisper her past. Not openly, but the brothels remembered. They always do. You speak with one of the caretakers, an old woman with a bent back and the voice of someone who's been corrected too many times. She doesn't confirm anything, but she doesn't deny it either. Instead, she tells you about a locked chest in the attic, unopened for decades. Said to contain letters, love notes, poems, maybe secrets, but no one dares open it, not because it's cursed, but because it's protected. History, she says, has its own sense of self-preservation. And it's true, because even now, even centuries later, official scholars reject the theory. They cite a lack of evidence, call the idea misogynistic, a smear campaign. After all, how could a courtesan born low reach the highest seat in the inner court? But that's the question no one really wants answered. Not because it's impossible, but because it's deeply, dangerously believable. And the implications are too uncomfortable, because if a courtesan could become empress, what does that say about the men who thought they were above her? What does that say about the rules they built to keep her down? More importantly, what does it say about every other girl they ignored, mocked, and dissociered, who might have been just as brilliant, just as ruthless, just as capable? You wander the house a while longer, eventually reaching the back garden. It's wild now, choked with weeds and memories, but at the centre still stands a single plum tree, bare, gnarled and stubborn. Beneath it, a small stone bench, carved with words in tiny script. She left no records, only shadows. You sit there for a while, imagining what it must have felt like to leave one life behind and step into another. To trade silk for silk, but change the meaning completely. To smile at the same kind of man who once bought your time, and now bows when he enters your chamber. It must have been exhilarating, terrifying, lonely, but above all deliberate. Because to rise in a world that insists you kneel isn't just ambition, it's war. And Lian Qiu, if the stories are true, won that war with silent style and a memory no edict could erase. Before you leave, the caretaker offers you a copy of a poem. It's short, unsigned, copied by hand from a letter that once circled court circles before being conveniently lost. It reads, "They said I was the silk between fingers. They never knew I was also the thread." You don't say goodbye, you just bow, low and deep, and step back onto the road. The sun is setting behind the city walls, and somewhere inside them a statue of an empress still stands, stone, serene, unchallenged, and somewhere else, behind a forgotten door, her fan gathers dust, waiting. You leave the capital behind you at sunrise, the walls shrinking into the horizon like a memory fading from the mind. The road south is lined with rice fields and ox carts, a slow-moving parade of people trying to forget something or find something, or maybe both. You're headed to a village no longer listed on official maps, though the brothel directories still mark it faintly, in ink that's almost disappeared, a place known once as Willow's End. Willow's End wasn't a city or even a proper town, just a bend in the river, a cluster of wooden houses, and a brothel built out of what used to be a granary. It wasn't luxurious, it wasn't famous, but it had a reputation, the place where fallen courtesans were sent when they were no longer profitable, but not quite disposable. The in-between girls, the aging, the injured, the inconvenient. What you find there is quieter than you imagined. No music, no perfume, just silence and chickens. The brothel, if you can still call it that, is now a sort of retirement house, run by women for women and mostly ignored by the rest of the world. A faded sign still hangs over the door, its paint peeled by years of wind. House of Second Spring. Someone meant it as kindness. You're not sure if it landed that way. Inside, the atmosphere is strange. Not sad exactly. More like a place where sadness has been boiled down into something manageable. Tea is served, games are played. Hair is still combed, but no one performs, no one entertains. The women here aren't selling anything anymore. Not their time, not their laughter, not their stories, especially not their stories. You meet the matron first. She introduces herself as Madame Anne, but you suspect that wasn't always her name. Her eyes are sharp, her smile never reaches her teeth, and she has the kind of voice that could stop a drunken brawl in 2 syllables. She doesn't ask who you are, she simply says, "If you're here to write about us, write carefully," and then she walks away. You're given a small seat near the veranda where some of the women gather, fanning themselves in the mid-morning heat. One plays a dulcimer softly, not for performance but for memory. Another peels fruit with the precision of a surgeon, her hands a little too elegant for this life. You don't recognise them from the stories, but you don't have to. Their lives are written in gestures. You speak to a woman named Suyin. Her voice is raspy from years of opera training, but she still hums between sentences. She was once known as Butterfly Voice in the river cities. Used to sing a duet with a man who pretended to be in love with me for 3 years, she says. He married the daughter of a salt merchant. Sent me a robe as a thank you. She smiles, holds up her tea and says, "I still wear it to clean my feet." Another, May Air, shows you her journal. Not poems, not stories, just names. Pages and pages of names. Men, women, sisters, rivals, girls she used to work with, who are now dead, missing, or renamed. She's trying to keep track of them all, she says, so at least someone remembers. That's what this place is, really. A memory archive. A living one. No books, no statues. Just women who refuse to let each other vanish. They tell stories over soup, not to entertain, but to verify each other's reality. They correct each other's details. They argue over who wore what, who sang first, who cried last, and they remember not just themselves, but each other. There's no glamour here, no gowns, no jewels, just old robes, worn slippers, and a quiet kind of defiance that no one bothered to notice before. And yet, this is perhaps the most radical thing you've seen on this journey. Not the scandal of power, not the intrigue of politics, but survival, unperformed, undocumented, unsold. No one profits off their stories anymore, and because of that, they finally get to tell them honestly. You ask if they regret it, the life, the years, the pretending. The answers vary, and Maya says yes, Suyin says no. Another woman says, "I regret getting out too late." Madame Anne, when she finally speaks again, says, "I regret not being born a man, but I would have been a terrible one anyway." You laugh. So do a few others. It's the first time you've heard real laughter here. Not bitter, not forced, just a shared joke in the last act of a long, complicated play. There's a story they tell you near the end of your visit, about a girl named Lin Lin, who came here after losing an eye in a fight with a drunken client. She didn't cry when she arrived, didn't speak for weeks, just sat by the river each morning with her hand resting on the scar. One day she stood up and said, "I'm still here." That was it. Just those 3 words. They stitched those words onto a banner that now hangs in the main hall. I'm still here. Not grand, not poetic, just true. It's not the kind of history that ends up in textbooks, too small, too quiet, but it's the kind that lingers, because it tells you what happened after the song stopped, after the courtyards emptied, after the names faded. Some of them lived, not all, but some, and that's more defiant than any poem. Before you leave, Madame Anne hands you a small bundle wrapped in faded silk. Inside is a fan, old, chipped, but still bearing faint calligraphy. It reads, "We were meant to be forgotten. So we remembered each other instead." You bow. She nods. Nothing more. You walk back to the road, the brothel shrinking behind you like a ghost house that never really left. And you carry their silence with you. Not as absence, but as proof. There's a rain tonight. Not a storm, not a drizzle, but that thin, stubborn curtain of water that hangs in the air like an unfinished thought. It slicks the rooftops and smudges the lantern light into long streaks of gold. You're back in the city again. Walking through one of the older districts where the streets narrow and lean in toward each other, like they're gossiping in the dark. You're here to find a woman who isn't a courtesan, but who spent most of her life living in their world. A seamstress named Auntie Wei. She isn't listed in any brothel ledger. Her name doesn't appear in court records or poetry scrolls, but everyone knows her. Every courtesan who's ever worn a dress that clings in all the right places, every madam who's ever needed something stitched at the last second, every musician who's needed a curtain mended mid-performance. They all speak of Auntie Wei with the same tone, not reverence, not pity, but debt. You find her in a crooked shop squeezed between a bakery and a bathhouse, its doorway draped with thick blue cloth to keep out the damp. Inside, the walls are covered with thread, not just spools, but lines of it hanging like rain in every imaginable shade. Crimson, ink black, soft jade, ivory, copper, storm grey. And beneath it all, Auntie Wei bent over a table with a pair of shears in one hand and a needle in the other, humming off key. She doesn't look up when you enter, just says, "You're tracking mud on my future sleeves." You apologise, she waves it off. Auntie Wei has been dressing courtesans for over 40 years. She calls it armour work, not fashion, not costume, armour. She says, people think it's about seduction, that a dress is just decoration. They don't know the math that goes into a neckline, or how many tiers I've measured to fit a hem. You sit, and she starts to tell you everything, partly because she wants to, partly because she's always been more comfortable talking to needles than people. She began as a tailor's apprentice in her teens, took in ripped sleeves, mended robes, hemmed trousers for petty officials who tipped poorly and smelled like wet dogs. One day, a courtesan wandered in with a torn sash and a black eye. Her name was Fen, and she didn't cry, didn't flinch, just said, "Can you fix this?" Auntie Wei did. Fen returned a week later with a friend, then another, and soon the tailor's shop became the place for brothel girls to get their silks mended and then their secrets stitched back together. She never asked questions, she didn't have to. Bloodstains, hasty tears, rushed adjustments, they told their own stories. A sleeve torn by force. A collar hastily replaced after a girl tried to hang herself with it and lived. Waistlines taken in as girls stopped eating from nerves, then let out again when they were pregnant and hiding it. She became known not just for the work, but for the listening. The madams paid me in coin, she says. The girls paid me in silence I was supposed to keep. And she did. But she also started making small changes, subtle things. She reinforced seams that she knew would be yanked. Added hidden inner pockets so the girls could stash emergency coins or notes. Created detachable panels so they could change appearances fast if they needed to escape a drunken client. Even experimented with lining sewn with tiny charms, protective verses folded into the stitches. She once created an entire set of costumes for a house known for theatrical performances, and when one of the girls discovered her client was an official involved in child trafficking, Auntie Wei altered her robe so that, when she danced, the movement would flash coded characters sewn in thread just one shade off. A warning, a message the official never noticed. But another girl did, and passed it to someone who could do something. She grins when she tells you this. It's all in the pleats, she says. People never look where they're not trained to see. There's no scholarly record of her impact, of course. Seamstresses don't make history. But if you ask any woman who survived the brothels of the capital between the 17th and 19th century, they'll tell you, without Auntie Wei, fewer of them would have made it out alive. There's a famous red robe hanging in her back room, not for sale, never worn again after a single performance by a courtesan named Julianne, who faked her own death and disappeared with her lover the next day. The robe was meant to distract. Bright, excessive, heavily embroidered. Auntie Wei designed it so that all eyes would stay on the dancer's arms, long, flowing sleeves that obscured her partner sneaking out the side gate. The plan worked. Julianne escaped. The robe stayed. You ask if she ever wanted to do something else. Make clothes for officials, for brides, for noblewomen, or she snorts. Why would I dress women who don't know what it means to fight for space in their own bodies? She shows you a drawer full of fabric scraps, each from a different robe, each labelled with the girl's name, date, and a single phrase. Some are hopeful. Started a tea shop. Married a kind merchant. Others are blunt. Vanished in flood. Didn't wake up. taken by guards, never returned. It's a fabric archive of women no one else recorded, a history in the stitches. There's an ongoing debate among social historians about the role of tradeswomen in courtesan culture. Some argue they were complicit, that they supported the industry. Others say they offered resistance through utility, but the argument misses the point. Auntie Wei didn't fix dresses to endorse anything. She did it because someone had to make sure these women could walk into a room and survive it. Before you go, she hands you a needle. Not for sewing, she says, for remembering. It's bronze, old, slightly bent. She says it came from her first commission. You tuck it into your sleeve, say thank you, mean it. Outside, the rain hasn't stopped. The street is dark, quiet, a little damp, but your coat feels warmer somehow, because now you carry a piece of the thread. And somewhere behind that curtain of rain and thread and time, Auntie Wei is still humming, still stitching, still saving girls one seam at a time. You don't mean to find the museum. Honestly, you're just trying to avoid the rain, which is falling kuways now, pushed by a late summer wind that smells like wet stone and something faintly metallic. You duck beneath an archway in a narrow alley, looking for a tea stall or dry bench, and instead find a wooden sign swinging from a rusted chain. No name, just 2 characters faded with time. Ji Xiang, roughly scent remembered. You step inside. The space is small, quiet and dim, the air heavy with sandalwood and dried plum blossoms. It doesn't look like a museum. There are no grand exhibits, no marble statues, no tour guides rattling off memorized dates. Just a series of rooms, each filled with objects arranged as if someone had just stepped out and would be back any minute. A comb on a table, a slipper by a doorway, a robe folded carefully on a lacquered chest. You see no labels, no glass cases, just tiny handwritten tags in looping script. First names, sometimes only nicknames, with short phrases. First performance, age 14. Last poem, never returned. This isn't a museum in the official sense, it's a memory house. A shrine for women who weren't supposed to be remembered. The curator finds you near a wall covered in silk ribbons, each pinned with a name and date. She's older, quiet, with a braid so long it reaches her waist. Her eyes are tired, but not in a defeated way, more like someone who's watched too many people walk away and still keeps the door open. She doesn't ask who you are. She simply says, "They're not ghosts, not to me." She tells you that the house was started a generation ago by a former courtesan who spent the last years of her life gathering forgotten belongings, items found in pawn shops, donated by retired madams, pulled from estate sales after brothels were shuttered. Every item has a story, even if that story is incomplete. There's a pipe once owned by a girl named Xue, whose opium addiction was so severe she burned through the sleeves of her robe and still played the flute for clients every night. A hairpin bent from use, belonging to a woman who used it to stab a magistrate after he tried to buy her daughter. A folded note tucked inside a beaded purse. If I vanish, it wasn't love. You pause in front of a guqin propped on a wooden stand. The tag simply reads, "She played until her fingers bled." The museum doesn't just preserve, it whispers. The rooms are designed not for display, but for immersion. You pass through spaces that recreate performance chambers, bedrooms, powder rooms, each one arranged to feel just incomplete enough to suggest the occupant has only stepped out for a moment. And in a way they have, because in this place they still exist. Not as legends or metaphors or footnotes, but as people. Laughing, grieving, playing music, drinking too much, making choices, making mistakes, surviving until they didn't. The curator hands you a small bundle of paper, reproductions of original writings by courtesans whose identities are now mostly lost. The writing is uneven, rushed, sometimes smeared with water or wine or blood. But it's clear they were never meant to be read by the world. These were letters to sisters, notes passed in shared beds, poems scratched in loneliness. One reads, "They say I have the voice of a phoenix. They do not hear me scream when the door closes." Another, "He said I was beautiful when I was silent, so I became ugly and lived." Some of them are funny, biting, sharp, even joyful. One courtesan described her client as having the passion of a boiled yam and the wallet of a starving goat. Another wrote a detailed plan for faking a fainting spell to avoid a poetry recital she was too hungover to attend. These weren't all tragic women. They were complex, angry, brave, petty, brilliant, just people. The curator explains that the museum isn't sanctioned. It exists in a legal grey area, technically a private archive protected by obscure donation laws. A few officials visit once a year to make sure nothing scandalous is on display. What they mean by scandalous is anything that contradicts the clean, patriotic version of the Empire's past. No mention of corruption, sexual violence, rebellion, or any courtesan who rose higher than the men around her. The curator nods to a closed room in the back. That's where the real history is, she says. We open it by request, or when we trust someone. She doesn't open it for you. Not yet. But she lets you touch one object, a small wooden flute, smooth from use, worn at the edges. It belonged to a woman named Lihua, who played it for 10 years before her hands shook too badly to hold it. No one remembers her songs, but they remember the sound of her breath breaking through silence. There's an ongoing debate in the academic world about how to preserve marginalised voices without turning them into spectacle. Whether remembering courtesans is an act of empowerment or a repetition of exploitation. Whether showing their artefacts is a tribute or a theft. But this place, this quiet, careful, rain-wrapped house, doesn't care about that debate. It cares that they aren't forgotten. You linger for hours, lose track of time. The rain softens outside. The curator offers you tea in a chipped cup and sits with you, not speaking, just being, and somehow that feels like the right way to honour all of this. Before you go, she invites you to write something. Anything. A thought. A name. A wish. You pick up a small brush and, on a slip of rice paper, write, "They existed. They mattered. I see them." You pin it on the wall between hundreds of others, step back, nod once, and walk out into the dusk. The museum doesn't follow you. But it changes the way the city looks. Now, every painted door, every discarded ribbon, every woman laughing too loudly on the street feels like part of a story still unfolding, still waiting to be remembered. You wake before dawn on your final morning, the sky a shade of blue so pale it feels like a held breath. The streets are empty, the city still curled inward like a sleeper who hasn't yet decided whether to wake or roll over. You walk through it slowly, quietly, or letting your thoughts catch up to your feet. It's strange how something so sprawling, so loud, so full of life and secrets can be this silent. Your path takes you along the old riverbank, the water low and sluggish in the late summer heat. There's a small pavilion here, half collapsed, its tiles covered in moss and dried bird droppings, but still standing, still refusing to vanish. You sit on the edge of the platform and watch the water move, not fast but steady. It reminds you of them. Of all of them. The women whose names you've carried from brothel to back alley, from ruined mansions to makeshift museums, their voices still echo in your mind. Soft, bitter, defiant, exhausted, triumphant. You've seen them painted on screens, whispered about in corridors, vanished from scrolls and stitched into robes. You've read their poetry, their pleas, their pranks. You've seen the shadows they left behind, and the silences people try to fill with convenient lies. And through it all, one truth remains. They endured. Not just the famous ones, the ones who played instruments for princes or escaped with clever contracts, but the nameless girls too, the ones who died young, who were bought and sold, who laughed anyway, who braided each other's hair, who smuggled secrets in sleeves and sang lullabies through tears. They weren't just victims, they weren't just vixens, they weren't just survivors. They were people, people who lived complicated, brilliant, painful, often contradictory lives. People who were punished for being beautiful, or too clever, or too poor, or simply born a girl in the wrong place at the wrong time. You think of Xue, who bartered her freedom one calculated sigh at a time, of Pei Hong, who sang until silence became louder than applause, of Moon Orchid, who ruled a room with a bow sharper than any blade, of Auntie Wei, who stitched revolution into sleeves and never asked for thanks, of Madame Anne, who remembered everyone else so the world wouldn't forget, of the anonymous girls whose stories ended not with climaxes, but with exhaustion. Cold floors, locked doors, and you think of yourself, not because you were part of this world, but because now it's part of you. You never imagined this would happen, that a history so systematically erased could become something so vivid, so human, so intimate. And now that you've heard their stories, you realise something quietly terrifying. The Empire never really killed them, it just made forgetting them seem polite, respectable, safe. You've walked through layers of denial, through the careful narratives of scholars who insisted brothels were sites of culture, elegance, and high art. while skipping over the blood on the floorboards, through the official documents that reduce women to line items of property, assets, liabilities, through the romance scrolls that paint courtesans as either tragic lovers or cunning seductress, never thinkers, never workers, never human beings. And yet, despite all that, despite the fire, the shame, the silence, they remain, in the music, in the poems, in the rumours that refuse to die, in the lines etched into old fans and the hems of old robes, in the eyes of a girl who hums an old tune while folding laundry, not knowing where she learned it, in the forgotten corners of maps, marked only by the memory of perfume, and most of all, in the people who dare to look, really look, past the myths and into the marrow of history. You leave the riverbank just as the sun crests the rooftops, golden, soft, like an apology that arrives too late but still matters. The city is waking now, vendors calling, doors opening, laughter already rising from an alley where two girls chase a chicken like it's a treasure. You stop at a bakery, the same one where, weeks ago, a retired courtesan used to trade poems for hot buns. They still leave one out for her every morning. You turn a corner and see a group of girls, young, beautiful, loud, headed toward a tea salon. Not brothel girls, not yet, but maybe. You hear their bracelets clink and wonder if they know the kind of history they're about to inherit. If they'll be protected, if they'll be lucky, if they'll have an Auntie Wei, or a Madame Anne, or anyone. You hope they do. You pass by the museum again, the door closed now, the scent of dried flowers drifting from beneath it. The wall still holds your note. You don't need to go inside, you carry it with you now, and maybe, in some strange, slow way, that's the point. This history, this banned history, was never meant to live in glass cases or dusty archives. It was always meant to survive in whispers, in footsteps, in stubborn remembrance, in the refusal to look away, because the Empire tried to reduce them to shadows, but you saw them, and now they're part of your light.